Chapter 742, The Last Glory of Balagang. Aizen Sosuke stood alone on the highest balcony of the palace, the wind tugging at his long coat as he stared out through roiling black clouds. Below him, half a dozen of his most trusted lieutenants waited in silence, eyes fixed on their master, anticipating his next command. But for now, Aizen remained lost in thought, his brow drawn tight, and his eyes glinting with a calm, unyielding resolve. "Hueco Mundo is no longer the arena I need," he finally said, his voice low and steady. One of the officers stepped forward, concern etched on his face. "My lord, with all respect, what do you intend?" Aizen turned, his gaze sweeping over the gathered men. "We leave Hueco Mundo. We cross over into the world of the living." A heavy hush fell. Hueco Mundo was a realm of boundless dangers, but it was also his domain, his fortress. To abandon it now meant plunging into the unknown. Yet none dared question him. His words carried the weight of absolute authority, and the officers bowed their heads in acquiescence. "Begin the preparations," Aizen ordered. "We depart at dawn." As his subordinates dispersed to ready the logistics, portals to seal, reinforcements to summon, Aizen returned his gaze to the horizon. In the mortal realm, he had caught wind of a breed of warriors who called themselves Fushenjutsu users, masters of sealing arts rumored to harness power rivaling even his own. The very thought ignited a spark of anticipation in him. "Let them come," he whispered to the wind. "The true age of Balagang's glory is about to begin." With that, Aizen Sosuke, the most feared figure in the spirit world, set his sights on conquering a new world and on rewriting fate itself. The power wielded by these beings felt utterly alien, nothing like the energy of the Soul Reapers or the Hollows, and wholly unlike the might of ordinary gods or gods of destruction. Ethan found himself fascinated and determined to learn more. Perhaps this strange force could reveal new insights, even breakthroughs, that he'd never imagined. After weeks of meticulous preparation, Ethan slipped away from the Shuya Palace under cover of darkness, accompanied by a small band of loyal followers. Far within the palace's depths, silence reigned, but for a barely perceptible weight of oppression, as if the very walls strained under some unseen force. Meanwhile, Zaraki Kenpachi and his war party had also penetrated deep into these forbidden corridors, reaching what was known as the innermost sanctum of Hueco Mundo. Their objective was simple and unmistakable: locate Ethan. But the intruders encountered no sign of him. Instead, they found an ancient throne room presided over by a solitary figure. He sat upon a colossal stone throne, his height and presence recalling the legends of giants. Age had slackened his skin into loose folds, yet beneath them lay sinews and muscles packed with latent power. His face was deeply lined, etched by countless years, but his eyes burned with a keen, unwavering light. Upon his head rested a crown-like headdress. At his waist hung a vast, golden disk that resembled a compass. A long coat, its fabric whispering against the stone floor, draped over his broad shoulders. Every inch of him radiated the authority of an emperor. Zaraki raised an eyebrow at the sight. Whoever this ancient monarch was, he clearly held dominion over these shadowed halls, and he was not the Ethan they had come to find. Yet as the old man's gaze swept over them, Zaraki sensed that their true test was only just beginning. Balagang Ruisenbang, the ancient great void who once held unquestioned dominion over Hueco Mundo, stood before them, every inch the embodiment of arrogance. He looked down on the 10 Espadas, Stark and Harabel among them, with as much contempt as he held for the lowliest hollows. In his mind, he was invincible, everyone else mere ants beneath his heel. Ethan stood shoulder to shoulder with Zaraki Kenpachi and the rest, eyes fixed on this living legend. When Balagang's lips curled into a disdainful smile, his voice filled the cavernous hall, sending a shiver through every soul present. "Are you the god of destruction?" someone dared to ask. Balagang's laughter echoed like shards of ice. "A god of destruction? Pathetic," he sneered. "Like those so-called gods of death, nothing but pests, crawling into other people's territory and wreaking havoc." His words reverberated off the stone walls, and Ethan felt a chill creep down his spine. Across the hall, Kenpachi's trademark grin sharpened into a leer as he demanded, "Where's Aizen?" "Humph," Balagang scoffed, as if the question amused him. "Aizen? He's been driven off, scared right out of my realm. He thought he could claim Hueco Mundo as his own. Foolish." He paused, eyes gleaming with triumph. "This is my territory. No one else gets to run wild here." At that declaration, Ethan exchanged a glance with Kenpachi and the others. They'd known they were facing something extraordinary, but now it was clear. Balagang Risenbang wasn't just another adversary. He was a force of nature, and they would need every ounce of strength and cunning to stand against him. They hadn't expected Aizen to withdraw from Huecomundo so readily. His disappearance threw all of their plans into disarray. Kenpachi Zaraki cracked a wry grin and shook his head. "Since Aizen's gone, I suppose it's just you we have to worry about now." Across the barren expanse, Balagang, the warlord of the Shuye Palace, rose to his full height. He hefted his gargantuan double-edged axe. The metal blades caught the light in dazzling flashes, as though hungry to sever any obstacle in their path. A savage grin split his face, and the fierce glow in his eyes made it clear he hadn't felt such excitement in battle for a very long time. "Humph," Balagang sneered. "Let's see just how strong these so-called gods of destruction really are." With a roar, he charged forward, every step thundering across the cracked earth. His axe blade hummed with a cold, lethal promise of carnage. Kenpachi didn't flinch. He straightened his shoulders, the tattered coat falling back to reveal the massive sword he carried in both hands. A faint golden aura coursed along its length, an unmistakable mark of his power. As Balagang closed the distance, Kenpachi's battle lust flared. He met the axe's deadly arc head-on, determined to carve a path through this formidable opponent. Boom! Ethan's twin-edged axe met Zaraki Kenpachi's blade in a thunderous clash. Sparks flew everywhere as Kenpachi, to Ethan's astonishment, held the impact with one hand. "Surprised?" Kenpachi jeered, his grin wild and taunting. With a casual flick of his wrist, the soul blade's edge gleamed coldly as it surged toward Ethan. Ethan's expression hardened. He drew in a sharp breath, weighed himself, then swung the axe again. The two weapons collided in midair with blinding light and a shockwave that rippled through the vast hall. Ethan felt the ring of authority slip from his mind for the briefest moment. Only once before, when he faced Aizen's mirror flower illusion, had such disorientation struck him. But Kenpachi's power was no phantom trick. It was raw, unrelenting force. And Ethan refused to be cowed. Steel rang on steel as the duel intensified, each blow shaking the pillars and sending shards of marble tinkling across the floor. Brilliant arcs of light danced between the combatants, trailing like comets with every slash. Neither showed any sign of yielding. Ethan pressed the attack, driving Kenpachi back step by step, his muscles burning with effort. Kenpachi met him blow for blow, laughter echoing in the cavernous space. With every crash of metal, Ethan's resolve only grew stronger. He would not lose again, certainly not to this warrior of sheer brute strength. Above them, the chamber trembled. A great chandelier wavered as if it, too, were caught in the maelstrom of their fight. Yet neither man dared glance away. Axe and sword met in a final, mighty impact that sent a wave of force roaring through the hall, leaving both warriors panting, their weapons locked. The outcome still uncertain. In that instant, as light and shadow twisted around them, Ethan vowed silently, this time he would emerge victorious. The air itself seemed to tear apart under the weight of their power, emitting a high, keening whistle. In the heart of the fierce battle, Ethan, Kenpachi Zaraki, and the others began to grasp the true horror of their opponent, Balagang. He was not only an immense warrior, but also a being of unfathomable ability. He could manipulate the passage of time and the aging process of anything he touched or even anything near him. It was almost supernatural. Each time Ethan and his allies drew closer, a cold, unseen force pressed in from every direction, like invisible hands draining their life force. Muscles trembled, strength slipped away as though sucked into a bottomless void, and every breath turned into a labor. It felt as if countless watchful eyes were fixed on them, waiting for their energy to ebb so they could be struck down. They steeled their wills to resist, but Balagan's power was relentless, endless. Despair threatened to overwhelm them. Amid the chaos, Balagan stood unmoved at the center of the battlefield. He cast a scornful sneer toward Ethan, Zaraki, and the others, each line of his face dripping with contempt. Chapter 743. Decay, Skull Emperor. Deep within the shadowed halls of the Night Palace, thunderous laughter rolled through the corridors. Balagan stood at the center of the vast chamber, his massive frame towering like an unassailable fortress. Pride and arrogance gleamed in his eyes as he surveyed his foes, mere ants in his estimation. "You imbeciles," he boomed, his voice reverberating off the stone walls and sending faint tremors through the palace's foundations. He tilted his head back, his lips curling in contempt. "Do you really believe you can defeat me with raw strength alone? Allow me to enlighten you. My death form, Decay, is the most potent of the 10 death forms. Your feeble powers turn to dust before mine." No sooner had he spoken than an invisible force erupted around Zaraki Kenpachi and the others, coiling about them like unbreakable chains. Instantly, their limbs grew heavy, as if each movement required the effort of lifting boulders. Every sword swing and every leap that had once come effortlessly now felt agonizingly slow. Even worse, they could feel their energy draining away, siphoned off by an unseen vortex of darkness. Struggling against the crushing weight of Bailargan's power, Zaraki Kenpachi ground his teeth. But with each heartbeat, the oppressive force only grew stronger, as though the very essence of his spirit was being consumed. In the oppressive gloom of the Night Palace, the Skull Emperor's laughter echoed on, a chilling reminder that true defeat might lie closer than any of them dared imagine. Ethan felt a storm of power rising in his veins, and with it, a white-hot surge of rage. His eyes snapped open, pupils blazing crimson, as he roared and fought against the unseen chains that bound him. Gripping his blade, he poured every shred of strength and fury into one sweeping strike aimed straight at Bailargan. In that moment, the seal he'd placed on himself shattered, unleashing a torrent of raw, unbridled energy. The sword traced a brilliant arc through the air, its passage marked by a resonant crack. To his surprise, Bailargan's lips curled into a fleeting expression of wonder. He hadn't expected such force from the man he'd dismissed as reckless. Boom! The impact rippled through the vast halls of Kion Palace, stirring a gale that whisked away settling dust and rattled the ancient columns. Ethan's blade cut through darkness like a flash of lightning, leaving every witness breathless. Bailargan staggered back several paces, yet his eyes remained cold and unbowed. A confident sneer played at his mouth, as if this blistering display of power had been foreseen all along. "Humph, it seems I've still underestimated you, Ethan." Bailargan's words carried no more contempt, only the sharp edge of newfound respect. He'd finally met an opponent worthy of his true strength, someone far more dangerous than he'd first assumed. "But do you really believe you can defeat me here and now?" A booming laugh rolled across the battlefield, brimming with absolute confidence. "My power is boundless. You insignificant fools don't stand a chance." His voice cracked the air like thunder. Then, in an instant, Bailargan's form blurred and a searing light burst from him, shaking the ground. He was releasing his Zanpakuto, no half measures this time. "Bankai, Decay, Skull Emperor!" With that command, his blade achieved its final form. Darkness and death coalesced into a towering skeletal monarch. Bailargan himself grew unnaturally tall, exuding a freezing, deathly aura that sent a collective chill through everyone present. He stepped forward, his head crowned with a multi-tiered diadem encrusted with crystalline gems that glowed with an otherworldly light. Where flesh should have been, there was only bone, yet not an ordinary skull, but one imbued with terrible majesty. From its empty eye sockets flickered a black flame, hungry and insatiable, as if it could consume the very world. Heavy boots thundered with each step, sending tremors through the ground. Dark fire clung to his bones, a deathly blaze that rotted whatever it touched. Living flesh withered and wood and stone alike crumbled to dust. From one side of his crown draped a long silver chain that trailed down to his feet, a symbol of unbreakable doom, the very chain of death itself. He threw back his skull and bellowed, "Behold my true power!" The roar rolled across the field like a storm, and a deadly wind followed in its wake. Wherever it swept, life and structure alike decayed in an instant, collapsing beneath the weight of that accursed breath. In that moment, every warrior knew. They faced not a man, but death incarnate. Kenpachi Zaraki and the others felt it the instant Bailargan unleashed his power, an invisible force coiling through their limbs, slowing their movements until it felt as if they were turning to stone. Even so, they refused to yield. Steeling themselves, they fought against the invisible bonds, searching for any opening to strike back. Kenpachi roared defiantly, and swung his Zanpakuto in broad arcs. Each slash crackled with the force of thunder, yet the swirling darkness at Bailergen's command absorbed every blow as if armored by iron. Still, Kenpachi's spirit did not waver. His eyes burned with determination, resolved to cut through any obstacle. Directly across from him, Bailergen lifted his gauntleted hands. Black mists coalesced around his palms, condensing into the shape of a colossal battle axe. Its blade, named Gran Caída, was enshrouded in blood-red chains that writhed like living things. A chill of death radiated from it, heralding devastation. Bailergen let out a low, rumbling growl, and the axe of destruction seemed to awaken. It swung in a mighty arc, cleaving through the air toward Kenpachi and his comrades. The wind from its path roared like an express train, and even from a distance, its sheer force threatened to overwhelm anyone who stood before it. At that instant, the battlefield seemed to tear itself apart. The very air trembled under the force of the attack, and every soldier's heart thundered in their chest. Even Kenpachi Zaraki, renowned for his love of violence, felt the weight of a power unlike any he'd ever known. Yet instead of stepping back, he straightened his shoulders and hurled himself at the oncoming devastation, a fierce light blazing in his eyes as if to burn away every shred of fear. "Captain!" Ikaku Madarame and Gongqin shouted, their voices cracking with desperation. They understood exactly what Kenpachi's choice meant. Their captain would always stand in harm's way to shield them. But facing this enemy's might, they could scarce imagine the horrors that would follow if he faltered. There was no time for second thoughts. In the span of a heartbeat, Kenpachi closed the gap between himself and Bailergen. With a roar, he swung his blade in a titanic arc and struck the axe of destruction head-on, pouring every ounce of his strength into the blow. Chapter 744, Kenpachi Zaraki unleashes the seal. "Ha ha! Come on, try to cut me down!" Kenpachi Zaraki's roar thundered across the battlefield, each echo rolling endlessly over shattered earth and broken shields. He moved like a specter, his steps tearing through space itself and leaving after images in his wake. Madness and exhilaration burned in his eyes. He lived for this clash of steel, this raw communion of strength and will. In his hand, his sword gleamed like a shard of moonlight, each swing ripping the air as if reality itself might split apart. Pouring every ounce of power and conviction into that blade, Kenpachi prepared to cleave his enemy in two and end this conflict once and for all. In that instant, his spiritual pressure erupted at a level unseen before, coalescing into a colossal golden skull hovering behind him. The skull opened its maw in a deafening roar, as though it sought to devour the world. It wrapped Kenpachi in its incandescent glow, forming a barrier of absolute force. The very air around him shimmered and crackled with heat, scorching even the crumbling wards of Bailergen's decayed fortress. Crash! When Kenpachi's sword met the enemy's weapon, the impact rang out like a thunderclap, reverberating across the field and declaring the true fury of the Blade King. Time itself seemed to freeze. Kenpachi Zaraki's blade slammed against Bailergen's axe of destruction, their clashing power twisting the air around them into visible ripples. Dust and pebbles spiraled outward in a chaotic whirlwind as shockwaves tore through the battlefield. Both warriors trembled under the impact, their limbs quivering as if on the verge of being torn apart, but neither budged. In their eyes blazed an unshakable resolve. Only one would walk away victorious. "Captain!" came the shouted concern of Ikaku Madarame and Koichi from the sidelines. Their voices carried equal parts fear and hope as they watched Zaraki and Bailergen locked in mortal combat. Each collision rang out like thunder, every exchange warping the very air with raw, violent energy. Yet still, neither opponent yielded an inch. At the decisive moment, Ethan summoned every ounce of his strength. He rammed his blade into the axe of destruction, wrenching it aside, then unleashed a savage swing with even greater force. His sword carved a brilliant arc through the sky, as if determined to cleave the heavens in two. "Ha!" he roared, the sound rolling across the battlefield like thunder. His blade shot toward Bailergen, like lightning ripping through the air. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to freeze. Only the glowing arc of steel and Bailergen's stunned face remained. Surprise flickered across the tyrant's features. He had never imagined Ethan could endure such power, let alone strike back with such ferocity. "Who do you think this king is?" Bailergen snarled. Then, with a deafening crash, their weapons collided once more, like two blazing stars smashing together. The concussive force rippled outward, making the entire plane tremble beneath their feet. The walls of the Night Palace shuddered under the impact, like the bark of an ancient tree battered by a furious tempest, spiderweb cracks snaking over its surface, threatening to collapse at any moment. Kenpachi Zaraki's blade, wreathed in solidified spiritual pressure, blazed into a massive golden-edged sword. With a single thunderous arc, it struck like bamboo snapping, cleaving Beilergen's axe of destruction cleanly in two. The force of the blow didn't merely shatter his weapon. It carved a deep gouge into Beilergen's own skeletal frame. Since the hollow was literally made of bone, there was no blood, yet the injury was as severe as a shard driven into living bone. Staggering back several paces, Beilergen felt his spiritual pressure surge and reel under the shock. He stared at the gash in hollow-eyed disbelief, unable to fathom how easily his assault had been turned aside. Kenpachi Zaraki, too, had begun to show signs of decay under the corrupting influence, but only for an instant. Almost immediately, his surge, golden Reiatsu swept those telltale cracks away, as if purifying itself. He felt power roaring through him like an unbounded river, and that golden aura billowed upward until it dyed the sky. The very ground trembled under such oppressive force. Earth and rock fractured and spun outward in a massive vortex. In the distance, Madarame Ikaku and the others were flattened to their knees, their bodies crushed by a weight they could neither see nor touch. Through the dust and debris, they watched Kenpachi Zaraki and his rival, Beilergen, locked in a titanic duel, each strike thunderous, each clash more furious than the last. Beilergen, standing closest to the heart of the turmoil, felt the shift first. Kenpachi's Reiatsu had soared to more than 10 times its previous level in the blink of an eye. It was inconceivable. No soul should be able to amplify their spiritual pressure so rapidly, yet the evidence was undeniable. Kenpachi's aura blazed overhead, and even as Beilergen raised his guard, he could only accept that Kenpachi had touched a new plateau of power. Kenpachi Zaraki's eyes gleamed with excitement as he sized up Beilergen. A new surge of strength pulsed through him, and yet a twinge of disappointment nagged at his pride. His foe seemed weakened. For years he had hunted for an adversary worthy of his full power, sealing away his own might until a true challenge appeared. Now, at last, he sensed it. Still brave enough to spar? Kenpachi roared, his tone equal parts taunt and thrill, like a predator who's just spotted its prey. Beilergen snorted, contempt flashing in his hollow maw. A vast old hollow who'd endured for tens of thousands of years didn't back down so easily. In a blur of motion, he closed the distance, summoning a massive sickle that sliced toward Kenpachi's midsection. Kenpachi's pupils contracted, but he stood his ground, raising his blade with eager anticipation. The two weapons met in midair with a resonant clang that rattled the ruins around them. A crushing shockwave slammed into Kenpachi Zaraki, hurling him backward with bone-jarring force. He collided with the ground in a thunderous crash, sending up a roiling plume of dust and debris that spread out like the detonation of a desert cannon. At the very heart of the explosion's aftermath, Kenpachi lay on one knee, dust coating his armor, eyes fixed unblinkingly on the open sky above. Chapter 745 Beilergen. What did you grow up eating? Beilergen's question hung in the air like an insult, a bizarre taunt aimed at testing his opponent's mettle. Across the wasteland, Kenpachi Zaraki's grin only widened. No hint of fear or retreat flickered in his eyes. Instead, he burned with anticipation. This fight was far from over. That's exactly what I want to find out, Kenpachi roared, tightening his grip on his sword. He knew Beilergen was one of the strongest warriors he'd ever faced, a ruthless force wielding a scythe that could rend the world itself. Most fighters would cower, but not Kenpachi. To him, a foe this formidable was an opportunity to push his own limits. He didn't intend to kill Beilergen, far from it. Kenpachi longed to capture him, to bring him back and forge him into a living god of destruction. Imagine a future where they clashed again and again, each battle more savage than the last. A perfect rivalry, each striving to outdo the other in a mutual hunt for power. Without warning, Beilergen sprang forward, his massive scythe whistling through the air. Silver arcs cut the space between them, trailing sparks of raw energy that threatened to tear Kenpachi apart. Yet Kenpachi advanced relentlessly, his blade raised. Their weapons met with a thunderous clang that shook the ground. Kenpachi's arms burned from the impact, but he held his stance, block after block, 3 times in a row, each parry fueled by sheer will. Dust and wind whipped around them as the two titans tested one another's strength. Kenpachi's eyes gleamed with delight. The real battle had only just begun. Under Beilergen's immense strength, the sickle proved devastating. In a single, brutal exchange of blows, the curved blade carved a shallow scratch across Ethan's arm. A trickle of blood appeared, too minor to trouble someone as battle-hardened as him. Yet in that instant, an unseen force crept through his limb, as if it were being gnawed by invisible worms of time. A searing pain shot through his arm, and it suddenly went limp at his side. Huh? It's broken. What the hell? Ethan stared at his arm in disbelief. Only moments ago it had felt like living steel. Now it hung useless, drained of strength, as though centuries of decay had ravaged it in an instant. A cold, mocking voice rippled through the air. Surprised? Afraid? Beilergen advanced with unhurried steps, his sickle still poised in his hand, glinting in the dim light. "Behold my greatest gift," he said, voice low and resonant. "The power of time, the power of aging." The menace in his tone was bone-deep, as if his words scraped against Ethan's very soul. Beilergen's eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction as he stared down his wounded opponent, ready to press the advantage and watch him fall to dust. "Humph, your oppressive spiritual pressure, for all its might, is nothing more than a candle in the wind before me. I have risen as an Arankar. My power over aging and decay only grows stronger. Not even you can withstand it." Beilergen's tone dripped with confidence and disdain. No longer content to play Aizen's spectator, he had been driven to unleash his full strength by Kenpachi Zaraki's relentless assault. As an Arankar, his power had surged to new heights. He stood firm, every inch of him radiating corrosive rot, as though the very air around him was being eroded by his presence. With a soft, triumphant sigh, he unleashed a tidal wave of decay. Any living creature caught in its path would instantly wither and succumb to old age. But Kenpachi Zaraki did not flinch. His spiritual pressure rose like an unbreakable mountain, immovable in the face of Beilergen's onslaught. That implacable force allowed him to shrug off the corrosive wave altogether, and the realization ignited a flash of fury in Beilergen's eyes. Ethan had never expected to find anyone in this world who could shrug off his power of aging and decay, until now. But he discovered a loophole in his own ability. If his sickle, forged from that very power, drew even the slightest cut, it forced rapid deterioration on its target. Not even Kenpachi Zaraki, whose spiritual pressure was legendary, could withstand it. Ethan's sickle was sharp enough to slice clean through Kenpachi's defenses, turning minor wounds into grievous injuries, or worse. Still, Ethan paused, locking eyes with his opponent, and offered him a final choice. "Surrender and swear fealty to me," he said, voice low and unyielding, "and I will spare your life." Kenpachi let out a booming laugh, the sound echoing across the battlefield. His wide grin revealed a mouthful of jagged teeth. "Surrender? You've got to be kidding," he scoffed. "I am Kenpachi Zaraki. I bow to no one. If you want my life, you'll have to take it." With that, Kenpachi hefted his enormous blade and charged. "Come and face my unstoppable power." Ethan snarled in response. His hand blurred as he spun the sickle into position. The air around it whistled like a guillotine blade in freefall, cold, precise, and deadly. Then, with a roar, he lunged. Steel met steel in a shockwave of force and sparks, the sickle's edge clashing against Kenpachi's sword. Dust and debris erupted around them as the two warriors unleashed everything they had. Kenpachi pressed forward, brandishing his sword with reckless abandon, each strike a cascade of raw strength. But Ethan was faster, weaving the sickle in arcs of shimmering steel, exploiting every opening. With each graze of the blade, Kenpachi's flesh trembled as though years were passing in an instant. Undeterred, Kenpachi roared, driving his attack harder. Their titanic struggle had only just begun, and neither showed any sign of relenting. Ethan raised his longsword and charged at Beilergen, igniting a fierce duel. Their blades met again and again, each clash ringing through the air like thunder and sending sparks and tiny shockwaves flying outward. With every strike, Ethan felt a surge of exhilaration flood through him, the same thrill he'd known in days of endless combat and challenge. His spiritual energy swelled, pressing outward so forcefully it threatened to shatter the sky itself. Recognizing that Ethan's power was reaching new heights, Beilergen shifted tactics. He abandoned head-to-head clashes of raw spiritual force and instead unleashed the cunning of his curved sickle. With sinuous arcs, he carved intricate patterns in the air, seeking to snare Ethan within their deadly geometry. Their battle intensified. Waves of distorted air rippled around them as each collision shook the earth. The roar of metal on metal grew so loud it seemed ready to tear the battlefield apart. But even as Beilergen's traps tightened, Ethan's latent power broke through every barrier. A blistering force rose from deep within him, propelling him onward, driving him toward a new, untamed pinnacle of strength. Ethan hefted his greatsword and unleashed an even more ferocious assault on Beilergen. Each strike landed with devastating power, and the aging warlord began to falter. His decayed strength was no match for Ethan's relentless blows. Though Beilergen's sickle remained remarkably sharp, it rang hollow against the sweeping arcs of the long sword. Fear and despair coiled in his chest. He knew he couldn't win. "No, this can't be," Beilergen bellowed, desperation in his voice. But Ethan offered no mercy. In a final thunderous clash, his blade met the sickle and sliced it clean from Beilergen's hand. Stunned, the warlord staggered back, panic flooding his eyes, and that was all the opening Ethan needed. With a single brutal swing, he drove the sword's edge into Beilergen's chest. Beilergen's body flew backward under the tremendous force, crashing into the stone wall with a bone-shaking thud. Silence fell, broken only by the echo of his fall. Chapter 746, The Unsealed Kenpachi Zaraki, as expected of Zaraki Kenpachi. Esdeath's voice drifted across the battlefield like a frigid gust of winter. Her tone carried a trace of admiration, but more than anything, it was clinical, an appraisal rather than praise. By the time Kenpachi Zaraki laid Beilergen low with that earth-shattering strike, Esdeath was already there, standing amid the wreckage as if she had materialized from thin air. None of the warriors engaged in combat, nor those who had just stepped back from the fray, had any inkling of when she'd arrived. Her speed and stealth were simply otherworldly. Esdeath's ice-blue eyes bore into Kenpachi, shining with genuine interest. Ethan had told her long ago that Kenpachi's true potential was so vast it bordered on the impossible, that even in his teens he had flirted with the very edge of death itself. Yet Kenpachi's formidable strength remained hidden behind layers of self-imposed seals, making him appear far weaker than he truly was. Esdeath had always trusted Ethan's word implicitly, perhaps as much as she trusted her own instincts. But one question gnawed at her curiosity more than anything else. Why hadn't Ethan helped Kenpachi dismantle those seals? With Ethan's power, this should be a breeze, at least that's what Esdeath expected. Yet he offered no response. Swallowing her questions, she turned back to the fight against Zaraki Kenpachi. In an instant, Kenpachi's Ryatsu erupted like a violent storm, sweeping across the battlefield. The sheer force threatened to overwhelm everything in its path. Esdeath felt a chill run down her spine. She had stood against the likes of Sosuke Aizen and Genryusai Yamamoto, but this raw, unbridled pressure rivaled, even outmatched them. What unsettled her most was the nagging suspicion that Kenpachi hadn't even tapped his full strength. In the Soul Society, a Shinigami's prowess is measured by the intensity of his Reiatsu. Those at the third tier, the Shikai level, have only just learned to release their Zanpakuto and are usually lieutenants or newly appointed captains. They must sharpen their skills on the battlefield before mastering the true potential of their Shikai. Within the Soul Society, spiritual power is ranked by levels, and even the mightiest fall short of its highest echelons. At the second level are the veteran captains, warriors who have held their positions for centuries, often well over 100 years. Their Ryatsu is as solid and immovable as a mountain, capable of overwhelming the fiercest adversaries with effortless authority. Above them stand the first-class captains, the true paragons of the Gotei 13. These Shinigami have served for nearly a millennium, and their spiritual pressure is as vast and unfathomable as the ocean itself, seeming to swallow all in its path. Yet Zaraki Kenpachi has shattered expectations. His Ryatsu has already surpassed the second-level threshold and now rivals that of the legendary thousand-year captains. In raw power, he stands shoulder to shoulder with the famed Captain Millennium. And even that is only part of his true might. Should he ever fully remove the seal that binds him, his strength will climb to even more astonishing heights. Kenpachi Zaraki radiated sheer power and untapped potential. Every time he stepped onto the battlefield, he sought to test his own limits, and every time he surpassed them. Esdeath's pale eyes flicked down to Balagang sprawled at her feet. He was breathing hard, forcing himself to his knees, but the fire in his gaze spoke of nothing but anger and disbelief. How could the former king of Huecomundo be bested by some unknown god of destruction? "Damn it," he ground out, voice hoarse. "A king brought low like this." Balagang's chest heaved as he tugged himself upright. Once he had ruled an entire realm of hollows, his strength and status undisputed. Surely someone of his stature should have crushed a so-called god of destruction without breaking a sweat. Yet there it was in black and white. He had lost, utterly. His crown of pride lay arid, his self-worth in ruins. He tried to push to his feet, but his battered body refused to cooperate. Defeat had never felt so bitter. Ethan's power had been all but crushed by Zaraki Kenpachi, and for the first time, he could no longer look down on these gods the way he once had. A heavy weight settled in his chest. He'd never expected to suffer 2 crushing defeats in a row. When he fell to Sosuke Aizen, the inscrutable god of death, he'd comforted himself with the thought that he'd simply underestimated his opponent and missed a few crucial details of Kyoka Suigetsu's illusion. But this time there was no illusion, no clever trick, just raw, overwhelming divine might, the power of the god of destruction herself. At the far edge of the blasted battlefield, Esdeath stood unmoving, her gaze locked on Ethan like twin blades of ice and fire. "Return the Daxu," she commanded, her voice chillingly calm. "This Daxu is an ancient relic of the divine order. Give it back." None dared question her. Madarame Ikaku and the rest, mere gods in comparison, bowed their heads in reverence, even their captain yielding to her supremacy. Only Zaraki Kenpachi met her stare without flinching. A wild glint sparked in his eye as he stepped forward. "Esdeath," he called, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "You've arrived just in time. How about a fight?" But Esdeath merely shook her head, her expression unreadable. "You're still too weak," Esdeath said, her voice ice-cold. "You haven't even tapped into your true power. Against me, a mere flicker of the god of destruction will cripple you." Her words cut into Ethan's chest like a razor. He felt the charged air crackling between them and narrowed his eyes, but he refused to flinch. He squared his shoulders and let out a low, steady laugh. "Is that so?" he called back across the battlefield. "Then by all means, show me." He raised his chin. "If you kill me here, fine. If I fall today, it only proves I was no stronger than a man could be." Ethan braced himself for the attack. Esdeath's lips curved in a faint smile. She admired his defiance, and she took up his challenge. Slowly, deliberately, she extended one pale arm. A brilliant blue light pulsed into being at her fingertip, deepening with each heartbeat. The frozen wind stilled as her power gathered. Ethan tensed, ready to face whatever fury the god of destruction might unleash. Chapter 747, Sit-Ups. Kenpachi Zaraki. Blinding light swelled across the battlefield, growing so intense it threatened to consume everything in its path. At the center of that radiance, Esdeath unleashed a soul-shaking aura, an abyssal force so deep and terrifying it immediately blanketed the entire field. The very air felt as though it were submerged beneath a crushing tide. Kenpachi Zaraki was the first to taste its power. His lungs constricted under the weight of Esdeath's spiritual pressure, as though a mountain pressed down on his chest. An invisible force gripped his limbs, turning his arms into lead. When he fought to raise them, each muscle fiber trembled under the strain. His breathing grew ragged, each gasp feeling like it might be his last. But Kenpachi refused to yield. Gritting his teeth, he summoned every scrap of strength to break the invisible bonds. Muscles quivering, he stared down the overwhelming pressure, a wild light burning in his eyes. He would not be crushed, not today. Though Esdeath hadn't focused her attention on the others, they still felt the full weight of her presence. Their limbs suddenly felt leaden, each movement a monumental effort. Terror leapt into their eyes as they realized this was no illusion. Beilergen, in particular, stood frozen at the edge of the group, staring at Esdeath and Kenpachi Zaraki in utter disbelief. How could a god of destruction project such an overwhelmingly oppressive spiritual pressure? He had heard the rumors about Esdeath's power, but now that he'd experienced it firsthand, he understood how wildly those accounts had understated her true might. Shame and fear warred within him, and he teetered on the brink of collapse. Just then, Kenpachi Zaraki bellowed. His roar echoed through the clearing as his muscles coiled and his veins swelled with exertion. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he fought against the invisible force, pinning him down, determined to break free. At last, with a deafening roar, Ethan shattered his restraints and lunged at Esdeath like a tiger freed from its cage. His massive blade caught the light with each swing, the rush of air around it whistling sharply, as if eager to cleave everything in its path. Esdeath watched him approach, a cool smirk curving her lips. Unhurried and untroubled, she murmured, "You've got potential. Breaking free from my spiritual pressure suppression wasn't easy, but you're not nearly strong enough." She raised a single finger. Behold, the flash of the god of destruction. In an instant, a blinding blue ray shot from her fingertip, blossoming into a roaring wave of energy that swept through the air with bone-chilling force. Frost crackled along its edges, every molecule of atmosphere turning crystalline beneath its touch. Esdeath's voice rang out over the tempest, brimming with undeniable authority as the destructive surge hurtled straight toward Ethan. Kenpachi Zaraki staggered under an oppressive force unlike any he'd ever encountered. Esdeath's power swelled before him, an icy torrent of energy that seemed capable of ripping open the heavens and shattering the earth. Yet in his eyes there was no hint of fear, only the fierce blaze of battle-lust. With a roar, Kenpachi swung his massive broadsword to meet that oncoming wave. Boom! The impact detonated like thunder, splitting the battlefield in two. The reverberation rolled out in shockwaves, as if the very fabric of the world were trembling. A blinding pillar of light, easily 10 meters across, enveloped Kenpachi's position. Its glare was so intense that no onlooker could bear to meet it head-on. Then, as abruptly as it had formed, the pillar erupted in a cataclysmic blast. The earth heaved beneath the force, great cracks spidering across the ground. Chunks of rock and grit hurled skyward, turning the air into a choking haze. A hurricane of wind exploded outward, flattening everything in its path and sending debris careening in every direction. Amid the ruin, Kenpachi's silhouette remained unbowed, his sword still raised, the relentless lie of his will burning brighter than ever. Under the onslaught of that howling wind, even the sturdiest rocks and palace walls shattered like glass, blasted apart one fragment at a time. Soldiers on the field were hurled to the earth or caught in the tempest and swept away without a trace. In the several-kilometer radius surrounding Kenpachi Zaraki's position, the ground was utterly devastated. What had once been a flat plain now bristled with bomb-like craters. Ruined buildings lay in splintered heaps, and the trees, torn from their roots, lay charred and broken. Each thunderous explosion rolled across the battlefield, as if a vengeful god of lightning were tearing reality in two. Scarlet fireballs, wreathed in thick black smoke, whirled through the gale like hellish comets. Whenever one struck, it erupted in a hurricane of flame, igniting everything in its path. Within moments, the entire field was awash in fire, the inferno roaring skyward and painting the heavens in furious orange and red. Flames roared like a second sun, their glare too fierce to meet head-on. From the scorched earth, a fiery vortex suddenly twisted skyward, swelling until it became a full-blown firestorm. Every rock, every scrap of debris that drifted too close disintegrated on contact, pulverized by the inferno's unbearable heat. The battlefield was hell itself, and at its center stood only two figures. Kenpachi Zaraki and Esdeath faced off amid the burning winds, their silhouettes flickering like dark gods emerging from the flames. Blood seeped from Kenpachi's many wounds, staining his tattered clothing, but he did not stagger. Instead, he straightened, chin lifted defiantly. "It stings," he admitted, voice hoarse, "but barely scratches me." A savage grin split Kenpachi's face, exposing row upon row of white teeth. In that fierce smile lay both arrogance and the raw thrill of battle. Esdeath's icy blue eyes narrowed in surprise as she surveyed him. For a moment, the two combatants simply stared, the firestorm raging around them. Neither had yet struck the final blow, but both knew the true climax of their duel was at hand. She hadn't expected Kenpachi Zaraki to remain standing after such a brutal strike. With a hint of amazement in her voice, she murmured, "Have you grown stronger again? It seems you really have no limits." His potential was, without a doubt, extraordinary. Chapter 748. The Fierce Demon Draws His Sword. Ethan could hear it. The soul blade in his hand was no longer just a weapon, but an extension of his very soul and the wellspring of his power. He felt the blade's latent energy stirring, weaving itself through his breath in an electric resonance. A thrill of excitement ran alongside a sharp edge of apprehension. He knew he was about to face a challenge unlike any before. Across the moonlit clearing, Esdeath's eyes widened. Her voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Draw your sword now." Ethan didn't hesitate. With a single, fluid motion, he yanked the soul blade from its scabbard. Instantly, an enormous force erupted from the weapon, rippling through the night air. The seemingly ordinary sword swelled in size the moment it cleared the sheath, its streamlined form gleaming with an icy light. Exaggerated in width and thickness, the blade looked as if it could cleave through mountains. In that electrifying instant, Ethan felt the bond between him and the blade crystallize. Power surged through him, every nerve alive with anticipation. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready. When Ethan stood fully upright, the broad blade alone reached the height of his nose, its sheer presence radiating an oppressive weight over everyone nearby. "Prajna fierce ghost," he roared, a primal bellow that shook the air. The sword seemed to take on a life of its own, reverberating with a deafening, bestial cry. Every witness felt that raw power pulsing outward, threatening to rend the very fabric of the world. "The captain has drawn his blade," Ikaku Madarame shouted, eyes alight with excitement. "So this is the true god of destruction," another officer gasped in awe. Even Gong Chin bowed his head in respect. Until now, Esdeath had held that title unchallenged. She had not yet completed the return of the blade, so her claim was considered incomplete. Ethan's sudden rise as captain now matched Esdeath's renown. What they did not realize was that Esdeath, secretly a world-class supermodel, wielded a unique aura that made her fighting ability far outstrip theirs. Though both bore the mantle of god of destruction, Esdeath's strength eclipsed them by an unimaginable margin. Ethan's lips curved into a feral grin. With a firm grip on his sword, he braced himself, and the waiting air crackled with anticipation for the storm he was about to unleash. Unlike any Zanpakuto he'd ever wielded in the Seirete, whose power he could never truly bend to his will, this blade sang in perfect harmony with his soul. Ethan, or rather Zaraki Kenpachi, felt it deep in his bones. He raised the massive sword overhead and bellowed, "Prajna! Fierce ghost!" In an instant, a blinding light erupted from the broadsword, and an oppressive wave of Reiatsu rippled outward, shredding the air like a raging storm. The very ground trembled under its might. Prajna's power was brutally simple. It multiplied the wielder's strength, speed, and spiritual pressure to unprecedented levels. But such a surge came with a price, a titanic recoil that could tear the user apart if they failed to endure it. Most would quail at the thought of dying in a catastrophic backlash. Not Kenpachi. For him, the risk was the ultimate allure. He let out a savage laugh, feeling Prajna's power thundering through his veins. He tightened his grip on the sword's hilt as if he meant to cleave the world in two. "Double it, then," he murmured to himself, a cruel smile twisting his lips. And with that whispered vow, he embraced the blade's full fury, and whatever price it might demand. Ethan inhaled deeply, calibrating his spiritual pressure to its peak. With a fierce roar, the latent power of the Prajna Fierce Ghost surged through him. His muscles stiffened as if forged from steel, and his bones creaked under the immense strain. Spiritual energy radiated off him in overwhelming waves, his very spirit body trembling on the brink of collapse, yet he felt only exhilaration. Gripping his sword with renewed fervor, he carved brilliant silver arcs through the night sky, each stroke drawn, eyeing him straight toward Esdeath with merciless intent. Unfazed, Esdeath raised her tegu, summoning a writhing mountain of corpses and a churning sea of blood. They collided with Ethan's blade in a cataclysmic crash. Steel rang against bone and sinew, sparks flying in every direction. A violent gust burst from the point of impact, tearing away the surrounding air and sending debris skittering across the battlefield. In that deafening moment, their clashing wills lit up the darkness, and neither was willing to yield. Both Zaraki Kenpachi and Esdeath sensed the raw power emanating from the other, and each secretly respected that strength. Yet neither realized how fierce this duel would become. Kenpachi first felt Esdeath's cold, abyssal aura, as though it had seeped up from the Nine Netherworld itself, and a warrior's thrill coursed through him. "Come on, Esdeath," he bellowed, charging forward. He swung his broadsword in a single, earth-shaking arc. The blade roared through the air, threatening to rend space itself. Esdeath met him without hesitation. With a graceful motion, she swept her own weapon into the fray and unleashed a swirling mass of corpses and blood, an ocean of death that clashed head-on with Kenpachi's demonic blade. The impact rang like thunder, shattering the nearby walls and sending stone and timber flying. Kyoya Palace, once the very symbol of splendor, collapsed in the first strike of their confrontation. Its towers and halls were reduced to rubble in an instant. Neither fighter yielded. Each collision of blade against blade sent shockwaves echoing through the ruins. Sparks flew, dust clouded the air, and the ground beneath them trembled with every savage exchange. The two warriors pressed on, their battle growing ever more brutal, and the world around them crumbled under the force of their duel. Their powers surged in a dizzying crescendo, tearing at the air until reality itself began to crack. Faintly glowing rifts appeared all around them, as if opening windows into another world. The assembled onlookers held their breath, hearts pounding at the scope of what they were witnessing. An unprecedented battle that shook the very foundations of Hueco Mundo. Kenpachi Zaraki drew upon the fearsome might of Hanya Mengui, escalating its power from a twofold boost to 3 to 4, and finally to an astonishing 5 times his normal strength. Each swing of his blade carried the force to obliterate mountains, shredding the battlefield with rippling shockwaves. Yet such tremendous power came at a terrible price. Kenpachi's muscles began to tear under the strain, blood spewing from the jagged rents in his flesh. His bones groaned like ancient timbers ready to snap. Still, he felt no pain. A wild fanaticism lit his eyes as he launched one last ferocious assault on Esdeath, determined to vanquish her completely, even if it meant sacrificing himself to do so. Chapter 749, Hyoshubu Ichibei and the God King. Ethan paid no heed to the deep fissures spreading across the Prajna demon's great blade. Whether sword or body, both had been driven to their absolute limits, and he was determined to pour every last ounce of strength into the fight. Esdeath watched his berserk assault with something akin to surprise. She hadn't expected him to surge in power so recklessly, yet the gap between them was not so easily closed. Steeling herself, she readied to absorb his final strike. Boom! The mountain of corpses and the sea of blood beneath them collided with the roar of the Prajna fierce ghost, birthing a hurricane that seemed to swallow the entire night sky and billowed upward like a monstrous mushroom cloud. But this time, the impact was different. Under Esdeath's overwhelming force, Ethan's sword finally surrendered. It exploded into shattered fragments that whipped through the air, many embedding themselves in Ethan's flesh. Pain lanced through his body, but he clenched his teeth against it, refusing to cry out. He knew he had reached his limit, yet he would not allow himself to fail so easily. Ethan watched silently as Kenpachi staggered to his feet, every step a battle against his own failing body. Blood trickled from dozens of cuts, and his limbs trembled uncontrollably. He tried to lift his sword again, but his arms wouldn't obey. With a rasping breath, the great captain of the Gote fell to one knee, and then flat onto the ground, utterly spent. His Reiatsu had drained away, leaving him unable even to move. Despite the defeat, Kenpachi felt no regret. He had poured every ounce of strength into the fight, and even in unconsciousness he wore a faint, proud smile. Esdeath approached, her boots clicking against the cracked stone. She regarded the fallen warrior with a mixture of respect and mild surprise. "You are strong," she said quietly, sheathing her ice-forged blade, "but even the fiercest soul has its limits." Kenpachi lay still, his breathing ragged but steady. At the sound of footsteps, Madarame Ikaku and the other Shinigami rushed forward. With gentle urgency they lifted their captain onto their shoulders, supporting him as they prepared to carry him away. Esdeath turned her attention to the other captive, Balagang. The hulking creature stood placid as coils of shimmering silver bound him. Those were the divine chains, Ethan's invention, each link humming with suppressive energy. No matter how strong a spirit might be, once the chains engaged, their reiatsu was sealed away. The more powerful the captive, the tighter the chains constricted, and few could break free. Yet Balagang did not struggle. His dark eyes flickered around the ruined courtyard, but he made no move to resist. The battle was over. Ethan gave a curt nod to Esdeath, and together they watched as Ikaku and the others carried Kenpachi from the field, the setting sun casting long shadows over what had been a titanic clash. Chapter 10: Reiatsu Overload. Balagang's heart pounded as Zaraki, Kenpachi, and Esdeath unleashed their might on the battlefield. He'd faced powerful opponents before, but nothing prepared him for this. How could a single realm harbor energies so utterly overwhelming? In that instant, he understood why Aizen had abandoned any hope of rallying the 10-blade Arankar. No matter how many they assembled, here in the God world, they'd all be annihilated. All around him, Arankar were battered by roaring shockwaves or snatched away through glowing portals into the celestial realm. Uojihua Lai gasped as two titanic Reiatsu signatures slammed into her consciousness. Had there been ordinary souls here, they would have been crushed instantly, reduced to nothing under that oppressive force. Even she, a seasoned warrior, struggled to remain upright. "Is that Zaraki Kenpachi's Reiatsu?" she whispered, disbelief coating her words. Beside her, Unohana Retsu's face remained impassive, but her eyes gleamed with recognition. One signature belonged unmistakably to Kenpachi Zaraki, the fearsome captain, who had only recently awakened from his coma, and the other to Esdeath, the ice general Unohana had faced long ago. Drawing her blade, Unohana's own spiritual pressure soared to the very edge of what any Shinigami could sustain. Kenpachi's single, gravelly syllable echoed across the plain like distant thunder. In that moment, everything fell silent but for the crackle of raw Reiatsu. No constraint of death or domain could bind Ethan's men now. Beneath those two titanic spiritual storms, any thought of resistance, any hope of survival, melted away. Ethan watched the shifting of the ether around them and thought, if his comrades truly possessed this latent power, earning a place on Team Zero would be within reach. Before he could dwell on it further, the air rippled, and Unohana Retsu materialized at the edge of the clearing. "Zaraki," she said simply. Kenpachi Zaraki snapped to attention. "Captain Unohana!" His rough voice carried equal parts relief and pride. Ethan and the others exchanged startled glances. So Unohana Retsu had been summoned into this realm of the gods as well? Before any of them could ask, Kenpachi winced and pressed a hand to his side, where blood seeped through his uniform. Unohana's pale eyes narrowed. "Injured?" "Just a scratch," Kenpachi scoffed. He straightened, though the only remnant of his Zanpakuto lay at his feet in two shattered pieces. "You're right on time. Let's have a proper spar." Across the clearing, Uojihualai's expression flickered with amusement. He glanced down at the broken haft. "What a pity," he murmured. "I was looking forward to testing myself against your blade, but if you insist on fighting now, we'll wait until it's reforged." Kenpachi's grin was feral. No time like the present. Ethan steadied himself, sensing the raw tension in the air. If Kenpachi engaged and Unohana accepted the challenge, this battle would eclipse anything they'd witnessed so far. "Very well," Uoshihualai replied, stepping forward. He reached to the belt at his waist and drew a sleek soul blade, its edge humming with divine power. "Tell me, Captain Zaraki, have you become a god of destruction as well?" At the same moment, Esdeath, who had been standing silently at the fringes, leaned in to inspect the blade's ethereal glow. Her cold gaze flicked between Kenpachi's eager stance and Uojihualai's poised calm. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. He'd come seeking allies and answers in this world of gods and god-killers. Now, he was about to witness a confrontation between legendary Shinigami, an ascended Soul Reaper, and a god of destruction. Whatever happened next would change everything. "Yes," Ethan inclined his head. Unohana Retsu returned his nod with a gentle smile. "Very well. I look forward to seeing your strength." Esdeath's lips curved into a confident smirk. "Zaraki Kenpachi is a formidable warrior, but even he couldn't faze me. As for you, Unohana Retsu, I'm eager to see something different." Retsu's eyes brightened. "I promise you won't be disappointed, Esdeath." She was as excited for her duel with Esdeath as she was determined to first settle matters with Kenpachi. On the opposite side of the divine realm stood the majestic hall of the God King. Its silhouette, narrow at the base, widening into a colossal inverted pyramid, towered over the landscape. A single, gargantuan pillar plunged into the earth below, anchoring the vast oval chamber that hung aloft. Bathed in a faint golden radiance, the hall filled the sky, exuding an aura both sacred and awe-inspiring. Ethan had deliberately avoided simply floating the hall in midair. Instead, he constructed a demanding ascent to test those who would enter. After enduring countless trials, Ichibei, the commander of the Divine Army, finally set foot on the hall's looming stairway. With every upward step, he felt his strength ebb, yet he pressed on, resolved to stand before the God King himself. Ethan stood alone in the dimly lit chamber, his aura strangely muted. Here, his once godlike power had been suppressed to the point where it barely rivaled that of ordinary souls beyond these walls. He waited silently as the massive doors groaned open. General Ichibei of the military command stepped inside. Even in the flickering torchlight, Ethan's form remained indistinct, shrouded in a silvery haze that obscured every detail, lending him an air of unfathomable mystery. God King. Ichibei dropped to one knee, bowing his head respectfully. I am Ichibei of the military command. You summoned me. Ethan inclined his head in reply. You came at my request. Tell me, why have you come? Ichibei drew in a steadying breath, rising to meet Ethan's concealed gaze. I seek the truth, he said. I must know what manner of being you are, God King. A faint smile curved Ethan's lips. No other God King may enter this place. His voice echoed softly, but I will grant you the answer you desire. In that moment, Ethan's hazy form shimmered with sudden light. A subtle, invisible force surged forth, weaving into Ichibei's mind. Images blossomed before the general's inner eye, ancient legacies of cosmic authority, the birth of worlds, and the true scope of Ethan's dominion. Each vision burned with a clarity that transcended words. Ichibei's heart thundered as the final image took shape, Ethan standing at the nexus of creation itself, a name whispered by gods and mortals alike. Overwhelmed, Ichibei fell to one knee once more, reverence and wonder mingling in his gaze. When the light faded, Ethan's presence returned to its silent haze. Ichibei bowed his head, voice trembling with awe. My lord, I understand. I am yours to command. Ethan offered a single, approving nod. The truth had been revealed, and with it, the bond between a servant and the God King was sealed. That was Ethan's existential insertion. He had truly woven his own being into the long, flowing river of time in this world. Chapter 750, The Problem of Hell. Since the mysterious insertion awakened his latent power, Ichibei, now the Imperial Army's commander, found himself recalling long-forgotten legends of the God King. According to the ancient tales, this deity was both omniscient and omnipotent, a presence rivaling even the Spirit King. Like a brilliant star piercing the void, its light banished every shadow. Yet unlike the Spirit King, who remained detached, preserving cosmic balance by dividing existence into three separate realms, the God King embraced a deeper calling. Confronted with a future threatened by the all-consuming void, he refused to simply unleash his might and obliterate it. Instead, he ascended to the role of world observer. From a vantage point beyond time itself, he watched in silence as the Spirit King endured a devastating ambush, then marshaled his power to create three distinct worlds. Each realm stood on its own, yet they were woven together in a delicate web of connection and contradiction, interdependent yet independent, bound by an uneasy harmony. Ethan stood in the emptiness beyond time, surveying the three realms that the Spirit King had fashioned. For eons, his presence, omnipotent and omniscient, had weighed on every would-be usurper of the Spirit King's power. They trembled at the thought that he might expose their crimes, or worse, intervene directly. So when he first descended as a mere observer, Ethan quietly wiped their memories of him. In that silence, free from fear of discovery, he watched the worlds unfold. Millions of years passed. Ethan's unblinking gaze roamed every corner of the Spirit King's creation, yet his curiosity remained unsated. Dissatisfaction grew within him, until at last he turned his power inward, birthing a realm of his own, the God world. Now, at the threshold of this new kingdom, Ethan sensed a presence behind him. You have returned at last, Your Majesty the God King, said Ichibei, the commander of his celestial legions. His voice, calm and resonant, carried through the void. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Yes," he replied, voice deep and steady. "I am home." Ethan gazed across the void where the three realms once stood. "I have watched the universe crafted by the Soul King for eons," he announced, his voice calm, "and yet I remain unsatisfied. I see the world not as it is, but as it could be. Therefore, I will forge my own realm, the God world." Commander Ichibe's eyes widened. He understood that Ethan's dissatisfaction did not imply any defect in the three realms, but rather a fundamental difference in how Ethan perceived existence. Where the Soul King saw a stable order, Ethan saw only unanswered questions about life's true meaning. By birthing a new world, Ethan hoped to explore those questions for himself. Ichibe struggled for words. Had the true Soul King resisted even once, Ethan's coup could never have succeeded. After all, the Soul King had been omniscient, omnipotent. He could have reasserted his sovereignty at any moment. Now, though, the throne lay vacant, and Ethan alone held the cosmic power. Ethan studied the commander's turmoil. "You know why I have done this," he said softly. "Tell me, Ichibe, what will you do now?" Ichibe forced a bitter smile and pressed a hand against his bald crown. "Your Majesty, there is nothing I can do but obey your will and hope you will return. If you do, the crisis in hell will be resolved." He bowed deeply, resignation and loyalty warring in his expression. "With your weight and the Spirit King's bearing down on the seal, there's nothing to fear. The gates of hell won't burst open." Commander Ichibe spoke with quiet authority. "Hell itself is the reason the three realms exist. It's a prison plane designed to hold back darkness. The combined spiritual pressure of Yamamoto Genryu's Shikai, Aizen Sosuke, and the others, even the Soul King, has been more than enough to keep hell's fury contained." Ethan leaned back, his tone casual. "You worry about hell? Spiritual kings can be Bo or En in the void. What's stopping a Hades or a Devil Lord from taking shape down there?" Ichibe's eyes snapped wide. This wasn't some idle joke. If hell actually spawned a Hades or a true lord of prisons, any being of that caliber, it could consume the world without effort. "We're feeding countless souls into this seal," Ethan went on. "At some point, there simply won't be enough to maintain its weight. Hell's great trap was its ability to dissolve spirits of extraordinary power. Yet there are souls strong enough to resist, to struggle against oblivion, and every ounce of their defiance only fattens hell's hunger." Ethan watched the shifting seal with a tightening knot in his gut, for he could sense something immense growing beneath them, something that might soon rival or even surpass the Spirit King himself. Dawn's pale light filtered into the Seireitai's War Council hall as Ethan stood at the center of the chamber, his posture calm and controlled. Before him, Ichibe, first officer of the military headquarters, staggered as if struck, confusion and dread warring in his eyes. Ethan spoke one word: return. In an instant, Ichibe vanished from the world of the gods and rematerialized before the assembled captains. The entire hall fell silent. Ichibe's voice trembled. "A single command brought me back to Seireitai. Not even the Spirit King, omnipotent and all-seeing, could do that." Moments later, word of Ichibe's abrupt reappearance reached Captain Yamamoto and the other senior officers. It had been months since the commander had breached the barrier into the divine realm, and his prolonged silence had fueled rumors. Some even proposed capturing the god of death himself to force an entry into that hidden world. Now, with Ichibe standing among them, Captain Yamamoto's steel-blue eyes narrowed. He rose from his seat. "Enough with the theatrics," he snapped. "Report immediately. What did you discover?" Ichibe drew a steadying breath and met Yamamoto's gaze. The weight of what he had witnessed in the realm of the gods pressed heavily on his shoulders. He truly is the Spirit King," Ichibe said, voice low but firm. "I have walked his domain, felt the pulse of his power, and still his authority was undone by a single word." A charged silence filled the hall. If Ethan was indeed the genuine Spirit King, the balance of power across both worlds had just been irrevocably altered. Ichibe of the military headquarters stood before Captain Genryusai Yamamoto and shared the startling memories that had surfaced ever since Ethan's arrival. An omniscient, omnipotent God King, known across the ages as the World Observer, whose reign had stretched on for millions of years, and the unsettling possibility that hell itself was incubating a new spirit king. The scope of these revelations overwhelmed Yamamoto's system. It overloaded and shut down instantly. Moments later, the old captain's consciousness flickered back online. He rubbed his temples and stared at Ichibei in astonishment. "All that upheaval took place in hell?" he said. "And we've had no reports at all?" Yamamoto's voice carried both confusion and frustration. Among the 4 great noble clans of Soul Society, there existed one family, its name kept secret, whose singular purpose was to study hell. For millennia, they had watched every tremor and ripple in that realm. If anything significant had occurred there, they would have sent word immediately. Yet here stood Ichibei, speaking with the quiet authority of the God King himself. Perhaps he really had witnessed these events firsthand. Ichibei met Yamamoto's gaze steadily. "Set aside the question of the God King for now," he said. "No matter how powerful a being may be, one with true self-will cannot be defeated." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent chamber, then continued with the urgent counsel only he could offer. Ethan's eyes burned with urgency. "Our top priority now is disposing of them in hell." They'd already shipped countless corpses of powerful warriors to the underworld, but no one could say what had become of those remains. Trapped within each body were spirit energies that refused to decay. If they hadn't broken down naturally over time, they might suddenly and violently erupt. Captain Yamamoto's brow furrowed. If those spirits still haven't decomposed after all these years, he let the sentence hang, the implication dire. Maintaining a smooth circulation of spirit particles was essential for sending bodies to hell. Any lingering, undecomposed energy would spoil the whole process. Worse, Yamamoto's own Zanpakuto, Zanka no Tachi, was out of the picture. Its flames annihilated spirit particles outright, too thorough for the subtle reduction required. Without it, he'd have to find another way to ensure these restless corpses finally reached their final destination. Chapter 751. Black Void. Captain Yamamoto's blade upends the balance that holds the 3 realms in harmony. Although it may seem impossible to shatter spirit particles outright, that is precisely the Quincy's gift and curse. Their power of annihilation doesn't merely expel hollows, it utterly dissolves them, along with every fragment of their spiritual substance, leaving no trace behind. In contrast, Yamamoto's scorching flame can't reduce a hollow's corpse to nothingness. It can only send it to hell to be broken down in eternal torment. For countless years, this method has gone off without a hitch, or so everyone believed. But a long-buried peril stirs in the depths of hell. How many furious spirits seethe with resentment after millennia of agony denied the release of decomposition? How fiercely do they hate the living for consigning them to such endless suffering? No one really knows, and Captain Yamamoto would rather not dwell on the question. Yet Ethan's warning sends shockwaves through the Soul Society's inner councils and rattles the Zero Squad's unshakable discipline alike. Deep within the gods' world lies a silent, somber enclave. Here, a line of hollows and arankars stand shackled in chains of divine energy, stripped of their strength and arrogance. Once the rulers of Hueco Mundo, they are now little more than subdued beasts, their once fierce eyes dulled by captivity. As they wait in uneasy stillness, the tension in the air hums with the slow, inexorable approach of something far darker than any of them has yet imagined. Ethan surveyed the gathered prisoners before him, hollows and arankars, wrists bound and heads bowed, none daring to meet his eyes. "Ulquiorra isn't here," he announced, his voice low and even. A soft sigh escaped him. Ulquiorra Sefer had once been one of Sosuke Aizen's most feared lieutenants, coldly efficient, fiercely loyal, and among the strongest arankars in Hueco Mundo. Yet now he had slipped Aizen's leash and followed him into the living world, evading capture. Ethan's gaze drifted to a tall, stern-looking woman among the captives. Tia Haribel, another of Aizen's elite arankars, waited in silence, her arms shackled at the elbows. Fate had not been on her side. En route to the living world, she'd crossed paths with Kenpachi Zaraki, who shattered her resurrection in a single devastating strike and dragged her back to the god world. In truth, most of Aizen's former forces now languished here in chains, but Ethan felt little need to linger on them. Despite their reputations, arankars like Haribel, and even others such as Nogo and Gay Liu, had long since exhausted their potential. They were relics of past glories, utterly capped in power. By contrast, the hollows he'd personally nurtured from infancy brimmed with untapped strength. That unbridled potential, Ethan knew, was far more dangerous and far more valuable than any Arrancar could ever hope to be. Ethan stood at the center of the chamber, utterly still, as if the very air around him had ceased to exist. To him, this gathering held no practical purpose, yet the mortals before him trembled in awe. Beilergen, the self-styled king of this domain, dared at last to speak. His voice echoed off the stone walls, a mixture of reverence and disbelief. "The omniscient, omnipotent God King, it's you." He strained to sense Ethan's reiatsu, but felt only absolute nothingness. This void was unpredictable, immeasurable. Beilergen knew of Aizen's dread. He'd heard the rumors, but seeing Ethan in person confirmed it. This being transcended hollows, Shinigami, even the Arrancars. Ethan wasn't alive in any conventional sense. He was something else entirely. So even Beilergen, who'd claimed titles, conquered foes, and forced entire legions to kneel, bowed his head. The man had been bested by Kenpachi Zaraki and bruised by Esdeath. He couldn't defeat his own captains, let alone the God King himself. At the far end of the hall, Stark lay bound, arms shackled to the cold floor. His expression remained impassive, but when he looked up at Ethan, an unmistakable tension flickered across his features. Stark prided himself on his spiritual might. He was a natural Vastard, unusually powerful from birth. And yet here was someone whose power was defined by its absence. Where Stark's reiatsu roared like a storm, crushing hollows the moment they dared approach, Ethan's was the yawning abyss. That emptiness was more terrifying than any force. He could sense it swallowing everything, leaving nothing behind. Stark had spent his life in solitude, yearning for a companion worthy of his strength. But whenever another hollow drew near him, they were instantly vaporized by his overwhelming pressure, and he had been left painfully alone. Now, confronted by Ethan's void, Stark realized there was something even lonelier than power, the boundless emptiness of true divinity. Silence reigned as king, and Vastard alike absorbed the truth. Ethan tilted his head only slightly, as though noticing them for the first time, and the chamber seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, it was clear, nothing had value here, except the God King himself, and the dreadful depths of his nothingness. Ethan stood before the gathered Arrancars, his presence surprisingly calm, given the tension in the air. Rumor had it that when Stark hollowified himself and merged with the Hogyoku, he hadn't grown stronger. He'd grown weaker. Whispers claimed his own longing to be powerless had been absorbed by the Hogyoku, leaving him diminished. Whatever the truth, his current power fell far short of Ulquiorra's resurrection, let alone the mythical second stage. "Anyone hoping to become the god of destruction is welcome to stay," Ethan announced, voice steady. "If you'd rather not, simply defeat my Black Hollow." "Black Hollow?" The Arrancars exchanged startled looks. With a single motion, Ethan summoned it. A living shadow coalesced at his side, the hollow he had painstakingly raised, infused with the latent potential of a Vasto Lord. Its form was as black as night. Even the mask that had once been ivory was now streaked in deepest onyx, save for a few gleaming lines. The horn-like curve carved into the mask suggested a unicorn, yet the creature stood upright at human height, noble and eerie in equal measure, a stark contrast to the bestial achuchas the Arrancars knew so well. Silence fell as the Black Hollow met their gaze, its dark eyes unblinking. The challenge had been issued, and the price of refusal, unspoken but clear. The vast cavern was suffused with a swirling black miasma. Despite the choking darkness, the oppressive spiritual pressure left no doubt. This was a hollow. Grimjow's voice rang out before anyone else dared speak. "So all we have to do is beat it and get out of here." Ethan met Grimjow's gaze with steely calm. "Exactly, but if you fail," he paused, letting the warning hang in the stale air, "you'll be swallowed alive." There was no mercy in his tone, no hint of regret. He treated their mission as business as usual. Behind Grimjow, Ironhead and Reckless exchanged uneasy glances, but neither man moved to volunteer. Not Grimjow. The battle-born leopard's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Sounds perfect to me," Grimjow growled, flexing his claws. "Let's see what this thing's got." He turned away from the others and with a fierce shout, "Crackle, Panther King!" slammed his blade onto the stone floor. In an instant, he transformed, his already formidable form warping into that of a hulking, humanoid leopard crowned in crackling violet energy. Then, with a roar that echoed like thunder, Grimjoe launched himself at the Black Hollow. But the creature did not stir. It stood silent and still, its bulk as immovable as a mountain. Grimjoe's charge struck the black mass and splintered the rock behind it, but the hollow itself absorbed the impact without flinching. Ethan watched from the edge of the group, heart pounding. The true trial was only just beginning. Ethan vanished in a blur, just as Grimjoe's massive claws were about to tear into him. Before Grimjoe could even register the movement, Ethan had reappeared, behind him, his speed outmatching that of the fearsome Arankar. Grimjoe whirled on his heel and slashed out with both claws, but Ethan anticipated the attack and twisted aside with uncanny precision. In the same motion, he countered, his fist driving straight into Grimjoe's ribs. A brilliant flash of pain shot through Grimjoe's body, and dark, inky blotches began to spread across his flesh. Grimjoe staggered, eyes widening at the creeping corruption. He pressed a hand against his side and growled, What is this?" A calm, chilling realization formed in his mind. This hollow's power was devour. Any spirit particle it touched was absorbed and converted into its own essence. "Devour?" Grimjoe hissed, each breath a struggle. "It consumes my Reiatsu and makes it its own?" Ethan's lips curved into a faint, grim smile as he stepped forward through the spreading darkness. "Exactly." Chapter 752, Devouring Grimjoe. Grimjoe stood alone on the shattered plain, his figure gaunt and isolated. The black stripes etched across his skin writhed like living snakes, each slither bringing searing pain, as though 1,000 insects were gnawing at his flesh. The agony burrowed deep into his bones, every pulse draining more of his strength, more of his blood and life. He could feel himself slipping away, his vitality sucked toward the distant void of darkness that hovered on the horizon. Yet he refused to surrender. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he forced himself upright. With a trembling hand, he tore free a jagged chunk of muscle and blood from his side. No sooner had he freed it than the flesh blackened, corruption curling around it like smoke. The piece of his own body dissolved into a swirl of inky mist, rising into the sky until it merged with that hungry void. The darkness responded instantly. It unleashed a roar so thunderous it shook the very air, reverberating across the battlefield and rattling Grimjoe's bones. He staggered, face ashen, utterly spent. There was nothing left of him to give. Ethan's body was a roadmap of agony, gashes so deep the bones showed through, blood pouring from every wound. If this kept up, he'd bleed out long before he could do anything else. Grimjoe's heart sank. He lacked Ulquiorra's lightning-fast regeneration. When he ascended to Arankar, he'd traded away most of that ability for raw power. He remembered how Ulquiorra had told Ichigo during their battle. Once he was hurt, it would take ages for him to heal. And here he was, not even given a moment to catch his breath. At the edge of the skirmish, Beilergen watched with a twisted grin. He made no move to help. Instead, he casually stroked his chin, as if contemplating a delightful puzzle. "So when you fight him, you just get eaten alive," he murmured, half to himself. The words trembled in the air. Beilergen knew this Black Hollow's devouring power wasn't mere consumption of flesh, it was a destruction of one's very spirit. In his eyes, no creature could survive such an assault. Harabel and Stark stood on either side of Ethan, their brows drawn together as the Black Hollow's oppressive presence weighed down on them. The creature's aura pulsed with a ravenous hunger, threatening to swallow anyone who underestimated its power. Harabel spoke first, her low voice laced with concern. "This Hollow's ability, it's far more dangerous than anything we've faced." Stark's jaw tightened in agreement. Underestimating it would be suicide. Ethan remained perfectly still, an almost amused smile tugging at his lips. He shook his head gently, brushing off their worries. Inwardly, he thought, "My decay ability can neutralize its devouring power. There's no need for me to rush in." He had loftier ambitions than simply defeating this foe. He hungered to ascend as a god of destruction, stronger than any god of death or hollow before him. Meanwhile, on the battlefield's opposite flank, Grimjoe's duel with the Black Hollow raged on. He unleashed blow after blow, but each strike was tainted by the enemy's corrupting aura, only to be consumed by its insatiable hunger. The fight continued, a brutal testament to the Hollow's terrifying might, and a reminder that Ethan's moment to act had yet to come. Ethan's wounds deepened with every passing second, and his strength bled away as if carried off by the wind. He knew he couldn't hold out much longer. Scars and gashes crisscrossed his body from head to toe, the cuts so wide that bone peeked through ragged flesh. Each breath felt like shards of glass in his lungs, and his blood pooled at his feet, yet still he pressed on. Surrender was not an option. He had to find a weakness in this living darkness, this black void, if he hoped to escape with his life. Time and again, Ethan hurled himself at the shifting shadow, striking with everything he had. But the black void simply flowed around his blows, mocking him with its impenetrability. A hard glint of determination flared in his eyes. Drawing, gay upon reserves he didn't know he possessed, he lunged forward in a fierce arc and drove his right hand into the heart of the darkness. He imagined ripping it apart from the inside, felt his muscles strain against its resistance, but when he wrenched his arm free, the void had not so much as a scratch. It remained whole, pulsing with an eerie calm as if fed by Ethan's own desperation. Ethan watched in cold fascination as Grimjo's right arm vanished into the yawning maw of the black hollow. First, it was held fast by some invisible grip. Then, inch by agonizing inch, it was drawn into the void and consumed. Grimjo cried out in pain, each scream a raw testament to the hollow's ravenous power. But Ethan felt nothing but admiration. From where he stood, he could see every detail of the battle. The way the hollow's gaping darkness seemed almost alive, quivering as it devoured spirit particles with uncanny precision. All hollows feed on souls, that was their nature, but most lacked the finesse to prey on such a microscopic level. The black hollow, however, was an aberration, its hunger amplified, its reach extending down to the very essence of a combatant's being. Even so, Ethan knew the world of the dead held countless countermeasures, tiny, almost undetectable weapons and spells designed to counteract particle-level attacks. Yet Grimjo, focused on brute force, had no answer for the hollow's subtle assault. With his right hand gone, his strength collapsed. His stance wavered, knees buckling beneath him. Still, Grimjo did not beg for mercy. He dropped to one knee, head bowed, as though accepting the verdict of some higher court. He had fought with everything he had, and while his defeat stung, he bore no regret. In his last moments, there was a quiet nobility in his surrender. Then, as Ethan observed without a flicker of sympathy, the black hollow enveloped Grimjo entirely. In seconds, the light in Grimjo's eyes was snuffed out. Only darkness remained, hungry, voracious, unstoppable. Ethan turned away, lips curling into a satisfied smirk. The black hollow had proven its supremacy, and in death, Grimjo would serve as yet another testament to its power. Ethan watched in grim fascination as Grimjo's body and soul were drawn into the black hollow, vanishing forever into its yawning maw of darkness. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the hollow's mask, the very shell that had swallowed Grimjo, began to splinter. Thin, jagged cracks webbed across its surface like lightning, transforming an already horrific visage into something even more nightmarish. "Is it going to shatter itself?" Ethan whispered, leaning forward. He knew the pattern all too well. After an Arankar fell prey to a hollow, the creature's own form would destabilize and collapse from within. Arankars were no ordinary hollows. Only those of Jillian rank or above could ascend to this level, mastering the very power of death. Their fractured masks peeled away to expose a chillingly human face, and they wielded weapons much like a Zanpakuto, each blade sealed by the Arankar's spiritual core. Despite their reason and armament, they remained voracious soul devourers, their steel-hard skin deflecting most attacks that dared strike true. Ethan's eyes glittered. "Once the mask breaks completely, this abomination will tear itself apart," he murmured. He steadied his stance, preparing for the moment when the hollow's internal fractures would become its undoing, and when he, at last, could strike. Ethan surveyed the battleground with a cool, detached gaze. The Arankar, hollow warriors who'd lost their masks, now stood arrayed before him, waiting for his command. At Ethan's signal, Grimjo had stepped forward first. He'd activated his released form, hoping to tap into the immense offensive and defensive power that transformation promised. In an instant, his strength should have soared, and his appearance should have grown more fearsome. But something went wrong. Grimjo's hollow mask shattered in 5 or 6 jagged cracks that spider-webbed across its surface, and then it went still. He staggered, unable to maintain his release. The hushed tension of the arena snapped into silence as Ethan's companion fell back, breathing hard, eyes blazing with frustration. A hollow voice rasped from the shadows, "Who's next?" Ethan looked down at the remaining Arankar. Their gazes flicked nervously to one another. None dared to step forward. They had seen Grimjo's fate and knew better than to rush into certain ruin. Ethan allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. The challenge was set. Now he would see which of these warriors was brave or foolhardy enough to face him. Chapter 753, Black Void Breaks the Mask. Ethan stood before the gathered Arankars, his eyes cold and unyielding. "There are far too many of you," he announced. "It's time to reduce the number by 1. He intended to test whether Haichu could forge a new Arankar simply by devouring one of their own. The moment Ethan spoke, the Arankars, each lost in private schemes, snapped to attention, panic flitting across their expressions. They exchanged uneasy glances, whispers dying on their lips. This was no longer a meeting of equals, but a hunt, and they had suddenly become the prey. Even Bailagang, ever confident, caught the tension in Ethan's voice. He knew Ethan prized Haichu above all else. If Haichu were slain, the God King would surely hold Ethan accountable. Yet Ethan showed no hesitation. His gaze swept over the assembled ranks, narrowing until it fixed on a lone figure. "Just you," Ethan said, pointing with deliberate calm. All eyes turned to Neutra Gilga, the self-proclaimed strongest of the 10 blades and bearer of the hardest steel skin. Pride gave way to shock as Neutra stared at Ethan, disbelief etched in every line of his face. He searched Ethan's eyes, as if hoping to find a mistake there, any reason why he, of all Arankars, had been chosen. But Ethan's expression remained as unmoving and impenetrable as ever. Me? Neutra Gilga's voice trembled with disbelief. He, the mightiest of the 10 blades, could hardly accept what he was hearing. How could he be singled out so easily? But Ethan gave him no chance to refuse. With a casual sweep of his hand, a crackling surge of Reiatsu yanked Neutra's body aloft and flung him toward Haichu. "Bastard!" Neutra roared as he hurtled through the air, his fury echoing like thunder. He had always craved an honorable death, a climactic clash against a worthy opponent, not this ignoble castaway. Abandoned so casually, he seethed with humiliation and rage. There was no time to think. Instinct took over as he whirled his twin sickles in wide, desperate arcs. Every slash, every thrust, was a plea for survival. He was born for war, for the glory of battle, and he would sooner die under the blade of a formidable foe than be used as a mere pawn. Haichu's strength was undeniable, but Neutra refused to grant him the respect of a true warrior. Just as he had once challenged Baragon, if not for that underhanded trick, he would have welcomed this fight. Now, however, Haichu was upon him with ruthless speed, and Neutra braced for the inevitable clash. Ethan knew better than to strike Haichu's body directly. One touch, and he'd be swallowed whole. Still, he swung his scythe in furious arcs, determined to leave some mark on her invulnerable flesh. Each blow, however, sank into her as if it were nothing but mist. Her form seemed spun from some unholy substance that absorbed every assault. Black void seeped onto the blade, sinister runes crawling across the once shining steel, devouring its spirit seed. Ethan felt his own power ebb away, even as Haichu's presence seemed to grow stronger. "Resurrect! Holy wailing mantis!" he roared. His body convulsed. A crescent-shaped horn erupted from his brow, yellow, cross-shaped markings seared across his face, and a jagged, eye-patch-shaped mask snapped over his empty eye socket. 6 chitinous arms burst from his back, each one gripping a gleaming, double-edged scythe. This was Ethan's true form, the holy wailing mantis, unlocking strength far beyond anything he'd summoned before. Ethan's speed spiked as he launched into a relentless onslaught. Wielding his scythe with all 6 of his arms, he became a whirlwind of steel and malice. Each sickle-like blade carved new lines across Haichu's form, gouging deep scars that for a moment drained his strength, only to vanish as swiftly as they appeared. Whatever strange substance made up Haichu's body seemed to swallow every strike, healing the wounds almost instantly. Still, Ethan refused to yield. The dark miasma lurking around him gnawed at his spirit, threatening to crush his will with every passing second. Gritting's his teeth, he roared, "I'll show you, I'm not weak." With renewed fury, he drove his scythe down in a series of brutal, sweeping blows. His arms trembled under the strain, exhaustion burning through his veins, but he pressed on. Every scar he left behind, every quivering cut was proof. He would not be dismissed as powerless. He would prove his strength, even if it cost him everything. Ethan gritted his teeth, raising the sickle in his trembling hand. This was his only hope. He couldn't afford to give up or retreat, not when he had one last chance to defeat Hakeshu. Summoning the final reserves of his strength, he charged forward, determined to fight to the bitter end. But it was futile. In an instant, Hakeshu's gaping maw opened, and Ethan vanished. The moment the second Arankar was swallowed, the Black Hollow's mask began to fracture. Hairline cracks snaked across its surface like a sinister spider's web, each fissure widening until a deafening snap split the silent field. Shards of the mask rained to the ground with a metallic clatter. When the dust settled, the fractured mask lay in pieces at the Hollow's feet. From beneath it emerged a startling visage, eerily reminiscent of Stark's skeletal countenance, yet younger and far more grotesque. Two glowing red eyes blazed with insatiable greed and hunger. Every Arankar present felt those eyes upon them, as though the creature were appraising them for its next meal. A cold dread coiled in their chests, rooting them in place. The Black Hollow's crimson gaze swept across the frozen ranks, selecting its next victim. Its eyes gleamed with raw, unhidden greed, as though every one of us were a sumptuous feast. "What an arrogant beast," Bylaghan muttered, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. Instantly, the Black Void's attention snapped to him, but Bylaghan held its gaze without the slightest tremor of fear. Chapter 754, The Unending Duel. A tense hush settled over the Grand Hall, as if the very air awaited a storm's first crack of thunder. At one end stood Bylaghan, chest thrust forward, confidence radiating from his every sinew. Across from him, the creature known as Hakeshu crouched low, its obsidian eyes glinting with predatory anticipation. None would have guessed that Bylaghan harbored any fear of Hakeshu. He'd boasted that the Devourer's famed hunger was little more than rumor. Still, the atmosphere crackled with imminent violence, the two champions poised to clash with all-consuming fury. Then a clear, commanding voice cut through the mounting tension like a river bursting its banks. "Now that Hakeshu has ascended, it's time you both mastered the power of the God of Destruction." Silence fell. Every eye turned to the speaker, Ethan, the God King, whose unruffled calm banished the charged hostility between Bylaghan and Hakeshu. Bylaghan bowed his head, a flicker of pride shining in his eyes. To him, Ethan's intervention meant only that his own strength intimidated the Devourer so thoroughly he dared not face Bylaghan unprepared. He trusted his power utterly, and trusted Ethan even more, for it was Ethan who had crowned him champion. "Yes, Your Majesty," Bylaghan rumbled, voice thick with reverence. Hakeshu, for its part, adopted a posture of respectful submission. To all others, it was a fanatical beast that worshipped nothing but the supremacy of its hunger, but before Ethan, it showed deference as genuine as any courtier's. Its loyalty mirrored that of Ulquiorra to Aizen Soyusuke, born not of slavish fear, but of an unbreakable awe. Ethan's gaze lingered on Hakeshu, curiosity dancing behind his placid eyes. Here stood a creature of insatiable appetite, now obedient at the mere mention of his name. What secrets lay behind such devotion? And more importantly, how might he shape the Devourer's power into a force worthy of the God of Destruction? As the echoes of his command faded, the first rumblings of their training began, and with it the promise of a conflict that would shake the heavens. Ethan delved into Hakeshu's mind and discovered that, though his exterior seemed calm, a feral storm raged within. This fanaticism wasn't born of simple bloodlust, but of an insatiable hunger for power and an obsession with combat. Hakeshu fought not just to defeat his foes, but to devour them, to absorb their strength and grow ever stronger. From the depths of his being, he felt that ravenous urge. Every battle was a feast, every opponent a chance to ascend. To him, devouring was the most direct path to might. Just as Bylaghan's decaying power sharpened at the brink of the abyss, so Hakeshu's voracious ability swelled when he tested his own limits. Ethan realized, too, that the God of Destruction's true trial was the integration of the soul blade into one's very essence. In the final stage, Known as returning the blade, the wielder's soul and the weapon became inseparable. The soul blade itself was the key Ethan had entrusted to them, the means to unlock their souls. Only by possessing this key could they fully comprehend and unleash their true power. Stark had also acquired a soul blade, but unlike the rest, he showed little interest in piling on new abilities. He was already so powerful that, paradoxically, he found himself craving weakness, seeking balance rather than boundless growth. For the others, however, fresh powers were impossible to resist, especially when they promised might far beyond their former limits. Under Ethan's guidance, they eagerly set about mastering the destruction technique. They knew that only by doing so could they truly become gods of destruction and wield the power to reshape the world. "You have the command of Daxu," Ethan said, addressing one of the Arankars. "I'm assigning you to capture Shu." "Yes, sir," the Arankar replied without hesitation. No one objected. They threw themselves into their training, determined to claim their divine titles. They were well aware that Zaraki Kenpachi had not yet completed Heis, his own god of destruction ascension, though they knew he would eventually draw his blade and secure the rank. Without embracing that same power, how could any of them hope to stand against him, let alone surpass him? At that moment, another request reached Ethan's ears. Unohana Retsu formally challenged Zaraki Kenpachi to a duel. This wasn't to be a mere sparring match, but a full-fledged contest of strength and skill. Retsu had dreamed of this day for years. She yearned to test herself against the only warrior who could push her beyond every limit. For his part, Kenpachi wouldn't have settled for anything less. If Ethan refused, they would have stormed through the divine gate into Hueco Mundo just to fight. Reluctant to see such titans clash uncontrolled, Ethan gave his consent and resolved to protect them both. Understanding the duel's significance, he shaped a private arena he called Muma. Stepping inside felt like entering a waking dream. Beneath your feet lay a boundless field of pure white snow, each crystal reflecting a soft, galactic glow. All around stretched an infinite darkness, as if the void itself had folded in on their battlefield. There was no breeze, no sound, no scent, only the charged stillness before two gods of destruction finally met in combat. Only two figures remained on the field, Captain Unohana Retsu and Kenpachi Zaraki. They stood like the poles of the universe, each one's awareness narrowing to the other alone. Unohana Retsu, graceful, lethal, wore her captain's haori over a black shihakusho that billowed like dark flames in the wind. Her long hair streamed behind her, and in her hand gleamed a slender zanpakuto whose edge looked sharp enough to slice the world in two. With a single step forward, she unleashed a flood of reiatsu so powerful it shook the very air of the arena. In response, Kenpachi Zaraki let out a fierce roar. His great blade crashed against hers with a ringing clang that echoed through the dim expanse. Sparks flew as their swords met, and a tiny explosion rippled outward, momentarily warping the space around them. Before the dust settled, Unohana had vanished, an almost ghostly flicker, and reappeared in Kenpachi's blind spot. Her blade traced a perfect arc, its keen light streaking toward his heart. But Kenpachi was undaunted. With a bloodthirsty grin, he raised his sword in a counterstrike. Steel met steel once more, and the war of titans raged on. Clang! The ring of steel echoed through the infernal world as two gleaming blades clashed once more. This time, the impact was even more violent than before, each strike sending ripples of force that buffeted the combatants. Unohana Retsu and Zaraki Kenpachi both staggered back several paces under the shockwave, but neither yielded an inch. If anything, their eyes burned brighter with the thrill of battle. With serene precision, Unohana swept her long sword through the air in a graceful arc. Each motion looked effortless, and yet every thrust and slice carried the ferocity of a raging tempest. Kenpachi met her onslaught without hesitation, swinging his own blade in wide, powerful arcs. Their swords met again and again, sparks showering like molten embers. Each collision detonated in miniature explosions, shaking the very ground beneath them. Energy waves radiated outward, tearing at the fabric of the infernal world itself, and threatening to rend the surrounding space apart. But neither warrior bent to the pressure. Instead, they pressed on, locked in a dance of death where artistry and raw strength collided in blinding, ear-splitting fury. Chapter 755, The Killing Maniac. On the battlefield, two entirely different forces collided with earth-shaking intensity. Kenpachi Zaraki was a living thunderbolt, his skin coarse, muscles corded like steel cables, and every movement brimming with raw power. His eyes burned with a feral light, wilder than any untamed flame. In stark contrast stood Unohana Retsu, graceful and lithe. Her long hair tumbled like a cascade of silk, and her slender frame moved with the poise of a dancer. In her hand, her blade gleamed like a silver serpent, supple, precise, and deadly. From the first clash, Kenpachi seized the advantage. He roared, a sound that echoed like a tiger's battle cry, as he coiled his muscles and unleashed an overwhelming spiritual pressure. Each swing of his massive blade struck with the force of a thunderclap, aimed straight for Unohana's vital points. Yet she stood her ground without a hint of fear. Unohana's form flickered through the air like a butterfly drifting among blossoms. Every step was weightless, every pivot effortless. Her sword danced in her hand, each arc and thrust honed to lethal perfection. Though Kenpachi's assaults thundered around her, she met them with unerring timing, parrying and slicing with such fluid grace that even his most brutal strikes seemed to miss by mere inches. In their deadly exchange, power and precision found themselves locked in a fierce dance, neither willing to yield an inch. Unohana Retsu's blade danced like the weather itself, sometimes a howling tempest, sometimes a peaceful, endless stream. Wherever her sword pointed, it probed Kenpachi Zaraki's defenses, exposing the smallest crack. As their duel wore on, it only grew fiercer. At last, Unohana unleashed her true strength. Her strikes sharpened and quickened, each swing carrying an almost irresistible force. Her style shifted with startling unpredictability. One moment she was a cunning fox, drawing Kenpachi into deadly feints and traps. The next she became a roaring lion, battering him with savage assaults that drove him back onto his heels. Kenpachi, however, met each challenge with even greater abandon. He didn't flinch from Unohana's assaults, he welcomed them. Gripping his sword, he delivered blows so powerful they seemed capable of rending the very air. His strength was beyond imagining. Each strike thundered toward Unohana as if to split her in two. "Now this is fun," Kenpachi roared, his laughter booming across the battlefield like crashing thunder. His eyes blazed with the thrill of battle, a wild beast in the heart of a storm. Ethan extended his rough palm and gently wiped at the gash on his shoulder. Blood welled between his fingers like glowing embers. He tilted his head, brought those crimson droplets to his lips, and tasted their metallic sweetness. A jolt of pleasure surged through him, electric, intoxicating, making his heart thunder and his muscles coil tighter. It felt as though an invisible force were propelling him forward, sharpening every blow until it crackled with raw domination. He raised his long sword and swung it in a broad arc. Each strike cleaved the air so fiercely that the atmosphere itself seemed to tremble. Then, like a phantom descending from above, Unohana Retsu appeared over Ethan's head. Her blade gleamed silver in midair, hurling toward him as if it were a meteor fallen from the sky. Ethan met her attack without hesitation. He brought his own sword up in a perfect parry, just as her blade screamed through the wind. Steel rang against steel in a piercing clash, sparks flying in every direction. The force of the impact shoved both fighters back several paces, and yet Ethan didn't falter. He let out a guttural roar and hurtled forward like a living cannonball, muscles coiled and blade at the ready. In that charged moment, nothing stood between him and victory. Ethan's long sword carved a golden arc through the air. Unohana Retsu's expression flickered for only an instant, no hint of panic, only a subtle shift in her stance. In the next heartbeat, she blurred sideways like a petal call, ached in a breeze, her blade transforming into a silver curtain of light. It shimmered into place and met Kenpachi Zaraki's relentless onslaught head-on. The two combatants were locked in a white-hot duel. Their figures darted across the battlefield with blinding speed, each blow and parry fraught with mortal stakes. They traded attacks and counters so quickly that onlookers held their breath, utterly absorbed by the life-and-death struggle unfolding before them. Then Kenpachi roared and hefted his cleaver-like sword high above his head, both hands gripping it as if pulling down the sky itself. A tidal wave of spiritual pressure burst from him, surging outward like an avalanche ready to consume everything. With a single earth-shaking downward slash, the blade split the air and seemed on the verge of rending the ground beneath them. Unohana's face grew solemn. In a flash, she sprang upward just beyond the strike's lethal edge, her calm precision the only thing keeping her alive. The golden onslaught thundered past, leaving a crack where the blade had screamed through. But Unohana remained unscathed, poised and ready to press her own counterattack. Ethan's longsword flared, its steel blade turning into a jagged streak of silver lightning as he lunged at Kenpachi Zaraki. Their swords met in midair with a piercing crack like struck metal against stone, so loud and sharp that everyone in the vicinity instinctively covered their ears. The impact splintered the earth beneath them, sending fissures racing outward like shattered glass. In an instant, cracks spanned 100 meters, and the resulting spiritual pressure rebounded off every surface, gouging layer after layer of ground as though a colossal knife had sliced through the battlefield. Kenpachi Zaraki threw back his head and laughed, a wild, feral sound that crackled with excitement. "Come on, let's see what you've got," he roared. He gripped his massive sword with both hands, muscles coiling beneath tattered sleeves, and raised the blade high above his head. With one battle-scarred foot stepping forward, his entire body tensed like a drawn bow, every ounce of his strength ready to unleash in the next thunderous strike. Kenpachi Zaraki's presence blurred into an unbreakable sword as he hurled himself at Unohana Retsu, his every movement dripping with murderous intent. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stall, the two warriors' forms locking into a living portrait of deadly grace. Then, with a thunderous clang, his blade struck the earth. Even so, Kenpachi's onslaught showed no mercy. He shrugged his right shoulder upward, dragging the sword in a widening arc before slamming it down with earth-shattering force. A golden wave of Reiatsu burst from his body, flaring like divine fire, transforming him into a god of war. That burning tide of power sliced across the night sky, bearing down on Unohana with relentless fury. A flicker of solemn resolve crossed Unohana's calm gaze. She leapt back and swung her own blade, but the torrent of golden Reiatsu was unstoppable. Boom! The impact rocked the battlefield, the ground exploding in a blinding flash at Unohana's feet as Kenpachi's golden onslaught rained down upon her. In an instant, the light erupted, its shockwaves rippling outward and shattering the ground beneath them. Chapter 756. Draw the sword and kill them all. The air trembled with raw energy as Kenpachi Zaraki stood at the heart of the explosion, an unyielding god of war bathed in blazing golden light. This radiance wasn't borrowed from the sun, it sprang from the titanic spirit pressure coursing through his veins, so potent it ignited the very atmosphere around him. Moments ago, he had met Unohana Retsu's sword intent head-on in a collision that rippled through reality itself. The impact tore two gaping wounds in Kenpachi's chest, blood fountaining from the gashes and staining his tattered uniform a deep, brutal red. Bones in his shoulders and ribs snapped, each fracture sending waves of agony through his body, but Kenpachi didn't notice. No fear darkened his eyes, only a savage exhilaration. For Kenpachi Zaraki, the maniacal connoisseur of battle, there was no feeling greater than the clash of steel and spirit. Every brutal encounter was a treasure, and this one stoked a fire in his soul that threatened to consume him whole. Thud, 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 his heart hammered in time with the echoes of combat. Raising his blood-slick blade, he let loose a roar that shook the very earth. His grin was feral, drenched in the promise of slaughter. "Come," he bellowed, "draw your swords and let me carve my path through every last one of you." The roar of clashing blades filled the empty battlefield. Every strike rang out like two meteors colliding against the inky sky, showering the ruined earth with scintillating light. Kenpachi Zaraki swung his sword in a brutal arc, each blow charged with the world-shattering force to sunder the very ground beneath him. Opposite him, Unohana's long blade met his with equal ferocity. Their swords unleashed razor-sharp slashes of energy that cascaded like torrential rain. Wherever those sword energies cut, the earth was upturned, its once pristine surface carved into a labyrinth of gashes and rifts. All around them lay a wasteland of shattered soil and wind-blown dust, the scars of their duel etched into every crater and ridge. It was as if the battlefield had survived an apocalyptic bombardment, its scars still fresh and smoking in the stale air. Then, in a sudden flash of light, Kenpachi's blade descended once more, swift and terrible, like a tiger pouncing from the shadows. His sword seemed to draw power from the very heavens and the earth itself, gathering a storm of destructive energy into its steel edge. In that instant, the sky trembled and the dust swirled with renewed violence, bearing witness to the unstoppable force of Kenpachi Zaraki and the unyielding skill of Unohana in every parry and counterstrike. Wherever Kenpachi Zaraki's blade swept, the air split with a piercing whistle. Unohana Retsu faced him, every muscle tensing beneath the onslaught of his immense pressure. It felt like standing under a crushing avalanche. Her bones groaned as if about to snap. In her hands, her long knife quivered beneath the relentless downward force of Kenpachi's own blade. Step by brutal step, he drove her back until his edge finally scored across her shoulder. On the silent battlefield, the sound of steel cutting flesh rang out like a bell. Brilliant scarlet blood welled through Unohana's uniform, soaking the divine suit that Ethan had specially forged for low-ranking Shinigami and Destroyer Hollows. Under normal circumstances, it could shrug off almost any assault, but against Kenpachi's raw spiritual power, it tore as though spun from paper. Still, Unohana betrayed no pain. Instead, her dark eyes shone with fierce delight, the same gleam Kenpachi wore whenever he met a worthy foe. In that instant, she tasted the pure, unadulterated thrill of battle, and nothing else mattered. There wasn't a hint of pain on Unohana Retsu's face, only a smile of eager anticipation, the very joy of combat. As they rose into the air, their eyes met, and it felt like electricity crackling between them. Kenpachi Zaraki stared back at her with a wild, fanatical light. He saw in Unohana a kindred spirit, someone who loved battle as much as he did, an opponent worthy of every ounce of his strength. His blood raced with excitement. This would be a clash unlike any other. Unohana's gaze shone just as brightly. She could feel Zaraki's immense spiritual pressure and raw fighting spirit pressing against her own, and it only fueled her thrill for what lay ahead. Here was a duel that would let her unleash her fullest power. In that moment, their fight transcended a simple contest of life and death. It became the collision of two warrior souls, each reveling in the wild freedom that comes from laying everything on the line. They welcomed the rush of battle, driven by a fierce respect for one another and an all-consuming desire to emerge victorious. Ethan watched in awe as the duel before him transcended the simple clash of blades. It was as if two souls were intertwining and tearing at each other, exchanging forces far more intimate than flesh could ever allow. Every heartbeat, every rush of energy between Unohana Retsu and Kenpachi Zaraki pulsed through him, and he felt himself drawn into their struggle. Unohana knew she could not afford a moment's hesitation. Kenpachi's wild, brutal swings had already drawn blood from her side, and if she remained passive any longer, the fight would slip from her grasp. With a steadying breath, she slipped her hand to the scabbard at her hip and drew forth her nodachi in one fluid motion. The blade sang as it left its sheath, erupting in brilliant lightning-white light that cleaved the darkness and bathed the field in an otherworldly glow. The moment her hand closed around the hilt, it was as though the sword and her very spirit became one. Raw power radiated outward, humming with potential. "Draw your sword." Her voice dropped to a fierce whisper that reverberated through the stillness, each word laced with unstoppable force. "And cut them down." At her final command, a blinding arc of searing light shot from the blade, setting the stage for the next, earth-shaking strike. The blade's radiance erupted like a colossal shaft of light, ripping the air with a searing crack as it lunged at Kenpachi Zaraki, promising to cleave him in two. In that moment, Unohana Retsu funneled every scrap of her emotion, her ferocity, her murderous intent, her pain, her hatred, even the raw sting of pleasure, into her reiatsu. She became a merciless weapon, her very being honed for the art of killing. Her spirit sword responded, reshaping itself in midair. The straight, elegant blade warped into a sinuous curve, like a coiling dragon or twisting serpent. Unohana lightly traced its edge with her bare palm, as though her hand were its scabbard. As she drew the sword fully free, its form sharpened, becoming more terrifying, more impossible to withstand. "This is my Bankai, Ken Slash." No sooner had she spoken than the entire battlefield trembled under the sword's overwhelming presence. Heavy reiatsu oozed from the blade like thick, dark blood. One drop, two, three. The blood-red spiritual pressure seeped onto the ground, instantly staining the pristine white surface a deep crimson. Chapter 757. The roaring Prajna ghost blood seemed to take on a life of its own. First it dripped in scattered rivulets, then twisted together into a surging river. In the sunlight, its surface shimmered with an uncanny red glow, as though the entire stream had been dyed from head to tail. With each passing moment, the current grew wilder, until at last it spilled across the land, a boundless sea of crimson that swallowed the earth like tributaries returning to the ocean. Waves of blood surged and roared, each swell brimming with murderous intent and crushing spiritual pressure. Within sight of its edge, the very ground quaked beneath the ocean's weight, and at its center stood Unohana Retsu, her form rising proudly above the waves. Her robes clung heavy with blood, yet her eyes blazed with fierce, unyielding light, as if she and this sea of slaughter were one. On the riverbank, Zaraki Kenpachi felt the power thundering toward him. He looked up at Unohana with unmasked astonishment, and beneath it, a raw excitement. This was her true strength. Kenpachi felt no fear. Instead, exhilaration surged through him, louder and more intoxicating than ever before. Ethan smiled, knowing that only by testing himself against an opponent like her could he unlock his true potential. "Ready to draw?" he called out, grin wide across his face. But instead of unsheathing his blade, he launched another sweeping slash at Unohana Retsu. The clash rang out over the open sea, steel against steel, bright sparks scattering like fireworks in the night sky. Unohana, however, gave him no quarter. With a precise, bone-chilling strike, she aimed directly at his sword's weakest point. A sharp crack echoed as Ethan's blade splintered under the force of her blow. Seizing the instant opening, Unohana unleashed a torrent of deadly power. Her next strike cleaved Ethan's shattered sword in two and sent him sprawling through the air. He tumbled end over end, finally skidding to a halt hundreds of meters away. When he forced himself to his feet, his chest and arms were slashed with deep, burning wounds. Ethan's chest heaved, eyes flashing with equal parts rage and awe. He'd never encountered strength on this scale. Unohana had clearly risen to heights he'd never imagined possible. And though battered, his spirit roared. He would not yield. Unohana Retsu's condition in this moment could be summed up in just 4 words: murderous resolve. Her body had become a raging furnace of energy, endlessly converting her own lethal intent into raw power and spiritual pressure. This was the culmination of centuries of suppressed hatred and violence, an intensity so overwhelming it defied comprehension. Any hope of calm or reason had long since been consumed, leaving only unbridled fury. Her spiritual pressure crackled with contradictions, at once manic and serene, chaotic yet unified, an infinite reservoir of deadly force. In the sea breeze, her long black hair whipped around her, and her robes had taken on a vivid crimson hue, as if stained by the very blood that now floated like mist upon the water. The sight was otherworldly. Her form materialized and vanished amid the drifting blood, like a phantom haunting its own battleground. Every swing of her nodachi seemed to cleave the blood-soaked sea itself, the blade's edges glowing with a grim, sanguine light. Standing across from her, Kenpachi Zaraki felt the raw brutality of her spiritual pressure and the sheer weight of her murderous intent slam into him. A deep, instinctive alarm flared within him, warning that this was no ordinary opponent, but the living embodiment of death itself. The clash of steel rang out like thunder across the blood-soaked ground as Unohana Retsu and Zaraki Kenpachi locked blades. Each strike sent sparks flying, echoing in the night like gunshots. They darted and spun through the crimson-streaked clearing, 2 ghosts dancing amid the carnage. At first, Kenpachi matched her blow for blow, his grin as fierce as his reputation, but with each passing moment, he felt the crushing truth. Unohana's strength was boundless. No matter how fiercely he attacked, she met him head-on, countering with an almost effortless grace. There was no respite. Her attacks came faster and more relentlessly than ever. Without warning, Unohana seemed to vanish. One moment she hovered at his flank. The next, her long sword reappeared in a dazzling arc under the moonlight. Cold steel glinted red as she swept in like a bloodthirsty dragon, aiming a single, devastating slash at Kenpachi's shoulder. Alarm flared in Kenpachi's eyes. He twisted away, carving a graceful curve through the viscous ground. But Unohana's blade followed him as if drawn by a magnetic pull, slicing past his guard and ripping a deep wound into his flesh. Pain bloomed hot and sharp along his shoulder, and for the first time in memory, Zaraki Kenpachi tasted true desperation. Blood poured from Ethan's wound in an instant, soaking his uniform in crimson. A searing pain, as if 1,000 needles were being driven through his flesh, shot through him. Around the battlefield, where rivers of blood churned beneath a red sky, the air seemed to solidify, an oppressive weight that made each breath a struggle. But Ethan refused to falter. From deep in his chest came a low, guttural roar, half man, half beast, that shook the air itself. His Ryatsu, icy and expectant like the calm before a hurricane, gathered at his core. Then, with a sudden explosion of force, it shattered the blood sea's confines and tore through the intricate sword-light barriers Unohana Retsu had woven around him. Ethan thrust out his right hand. Instantly, his palm hardened to iron, becoming the perfect sheath. He clasped the hilt of his soul blade and heaved. With a thunderous crack, the massive weapon sprang free, its edge glinting with a razor-cold light. A wave of crushing spiritual pressure and raw, murderous intent roared from the blade, ripping across the battlefield like a savage storm, and every living thing recoiled in terror. Roar! A deafening roar tore through the air as the soul blade manifested, its arrival announced to every corner of the battlefield. Ethan Zaraki gripped the hilt, feeling the sword's immense power surge through him. A satisfied grin spread across his face. Captain Unohana Retsu's emerald eyes widened at the sight of the massive blade. "Is this your Bankai?" Ethan lifted the sword for her to see. "Yes, it's called Hania Mengui." He shifted his stance, the blade humming with condensed Reiatsu. "This form multiplies my strength and spiritual pressure. I've refined it to twice its original power." Unohana nodded, impressed. "Incredible, you've completely surpassed your former self." Relief softened her expression as she met his gaze. "Now, let all else fall away. Let's fight with everything we have." Before she even finished speaking, Ethan launched into motion, swinging Hania Mengui in a sweeping arc that crackled with unleashed energy. A sudden whirlwind of sword energy erupted from Unohana Retsu's blade, rushing towards Zaraki Kenpachi with an almost unstoppable force. The raging vortex carried enough destructive power to tear everything in its path to shreds. Yet Kenpachi didn't flinch or step aside. He stood firm, ready to meet the onslaught head-on. Chapter 758, The Duel of Blades. On the vast battlefield, Ethan stood unmoving, as steadfast as a lone pine against the wind. In his hands, the great blade Prajna Mengui gleamed, a massive, broad sword that looked more like the sleeping body of a gargantuan beast than mere steel. Its cold surface caught the dying light of day, promising devastating power. Ahead of him, a spiraling tempest gathered, whipped into a frenzied hurricane. Dust and debris danced in its maw, and the wind roared like a living thing. Ethan's eyes blazed with unyielding resolve. He welcomed the challenge rather than shrink from it. Clenching the sword's hilt, he rooted himself firmly, feet braced against the churned earth. Without hesitation, Ethan raised Prajna Mengui high and brought its weight crashing down in a single, fluid arc. The wind whistled past the blade as he carved through the raging storm, unleashing a shockwave of force that burst outward like an eruption. The hurricane answered with a deafening howl, but it was no match for the blade's raw might. In an instant, the tempest was rent asunder, shards of wind fracturing into 1,000 razor-edged slivers that scattered across the plain. For a heartbeat, the battlefield fell silent. Dust swirled where the tempest once stood, and the only sound was the distant patter of those fractured winds. But the moment of calm lasted barely a breath. From the opposite side of the field, Unohana Retsu, master of healing arts turned devastating warrior, had been the storm's architect. She watched the aftermath of Ethan's strike with cool detachment. The splintered wind blades, far from harmless, whipped back toward her in a cascading attack. Ethan held his ground, muscles taut, eyeing Unohana's next move. Neither warrior spoke. Their weapons claimed the conversation. As the wind blades closed in, the duel entered its next phase, a clash of wills and skill that would determine who stood victorious when the dust finally settled. Ethan froze in place as Unohana Retsu's blade came to life. A steely gleam flickered in her half-lidded eyes, and with a single fluid motion, she tapped the tip of her sword against the empty air. Faint ripples of sword winds sprang to life, hurtling downward like slicing blades. Ethan countered, unleashing his own downward gust, but one by one, Unohana's winds met his and shattered in sharp, ringing clashes. Each strike rang out like a gong, her mastery obvious in every perfectly judged parry. Their gazes locked, two lightning bolts crackling in midair, and then, as if snatched by some unseen force, they both vanished. An almost tangible tension settled over the clearing, as though the world itself were holding its breath, awaiting the next explosion. Boom! The roar that followed shook the very ground beneath them. In an instant, Ethan and Unohana reappeared high above the battlefield, locked in fierce combat. The world around them blurred into sterility, all color draining away until only their twisting forms and the glint of steel remained. Then, at the exact moment their blades met once more, a blinding flash of light erupted from the point of impact, washing everything in searing brilliance. Time seemed to fracture as that radiance spread, promising an earth-shattering clash yet to come. Ethan braced himself as the shockwave's gale swept across the battlefield, rippling the air into rolling waves. Yet within that turbulent vortex of spiritual pressure, he and his opponent remained utterly unshaken. Before the wind could even die down, both raised their swords and lunged at each other once more. Clang! 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 The impact of steel on steel rang out like a sudden downpour, each strike birthing sparks and afterimages that danced through the air. Every blow seemed intent on ripping the very fabric of the atmosphere apart. Across from him stood Unohana Retsu, her swordwork as deadly as it was beautiful. She moved through the 9 fundamental slashes of her art with effortless grace, weaving in countless subtle variations. Her blade flowed like a wool-illed stallion racing free, like an antelope darting and twisting its horns, every attack flawlessly executed, every transition unpredictable. Watching her was like witnessing a storm of elegance and power fused into one, each cut both terrifyingly sharp and mesmerically beautiful. Although Kenpachi Zaraki's style lacks the subtle refinements of Unohana Retsu, his raw strength more than makes up for it. His blade work is simple and unadorned, yet devastating in its power. Each strike lands with the weight of 1,000 tons, impossible to block. What appears crude hides a clever economy of motion. He needs no elaborate techniques, only the most basic swings, unleashed with maximum force. Every cut is an unstoppable landslide. When their swords met in midair, the collision rang out like thunder ripping through the sky. The shockwave rattled the ears and beat against the chest. Unohana's pupils narrowed. The ferocity Kenpachi now displayed eclipsed all her expectations. A storm of power radiated from his blade, so intense that it shook her to her core and threatened to throw both her and her sword off balance. Ethan had become one with his sword. Its hilt felt like an extension of his own arm, its blade as natural to him as his flesh and bone. He could sheath and draw it with a thought, even use it to button his jacket. Yet in that moment, he realized he could no longer hold it. Kenpachi Zaraki's style was a tempest given form. Each swing of his blade was as weighty and inexorable as a thunderclap splitting the sky. In a single, fluid motion, Kenpachi seized Ethan's greatsword by the hilt, yanked it free from his grip, and followed through with a downward strike of his own massive blade. The steel cut the air like lightning, shrieking with the sound of tearing wind before it slammed into Ethan's chest. A hollow crash echoed across the clearing. Pain exploded through Ethan's body as the force of the blow sent him somersaulting backward. He hit the ground hard, then rolled to his feet on shaking legs. He glanced down and saw a deep gash in his chest, ribs laid bare, shoulder blade split, blood pouring from the wound in a crimson waterfall that quickly soaked through his coat and pooled at his feet. Still, Ethan's face held no agony, quite the opposite. A fierce thrill gleamed in his eyes. He wiped a spatter of blood from his mouth and squared his shoulders. The storm of Kenpachi's assault had only stoked a fire within him. And now, with every fiber of his being, he was more determined than ever to meet that storm head-on. Ethan knelt beside Captain Unohana Retsu, heart pounding as her fingertips brushed over the gruesome wound. Flesh and blood turned inside out. The instant her skin made contact, a faint, blood-red glow blossomed from the cut, flickering like a living ember in the dim light. Under that eerie radiance, the injury began to repair itself at an astonishing pace. Tissue wove back together, blood vessels reformed, and shattered bone knit itself whole. Within moments, the deep gash, once gaping down to the bone, had vanished entirely, leaving only smooth, unblemished skin. Even the jagged scar Zaraki had carved into her at the start of their duel was gone. Both warrior and captain had changed since then, and neither needed that mark anymore. Without the boundless regenerative power of her Bankai, Jinjin Onin, Unohana Retsu would be no different from any other Soul Reaper. Her mastery of spiritual energy, so adept at destruction, proved equally potent in the art of healing. Unohana Retsu stood firm, utterly unfazed by any threat. With deliberate calm, she raised her blade at a sharp diagonal and drew it through the earth. In an instant, the sword's pressure carved a flawless, mirror-smooth trench into the ground. Even Wujian's notoriously dense spirit particle matrix proved as brittle as tofu beneath her edge. She glanced up at Kenpachi Zaraki and simply said, "Proceed." A suffocating stillness filled the air, as though time itself had frozen in deference. Unohana's sword gleamed with a pulsing, blood-red Reiatsu. The energy coiled and writhed around the blade like a pack of dragons in furious battle, each twist and roar promising devastating power. Chapter 759. A hush fell over the battlefield as Unohana Retsu's blade came to rest, its final stroke hanging in the air like a line of ancient verse. In that instant, the Reiatsu she'd honed through countless encounters surged forth in a volcanic eruption of blood-red energy. The power coalesced into a vast, crescent-shaped wave of sword energy that cut through the night sky like a flaming meteor, hurtling towards Zaraki Kenpachi with unstoppable momentum. The air trembled as the scarlet arc tore through space. Time itself seemed to waver at the edge of its wrath. Its radiant glow banished half the darkness above, and the surrounding smoke and dust parted, revealing a cold, star-studded sky. Yet Kenpachi stood unmoved, his composure curiously serene in the face of such a sudden assault. He tilted his head once, as though he'd been waiting for Unohana's strike all along. Then, without hesitation, he lifted his right hand, scarred and thick-jointed, and pressed his palm against the blood-red crescent, halting its advance in perfect stillness. Kenpachi Zaraki's palm, honed to iron-hard resilience through countless battles, throbbed with a fierce, golden spiritual pressure. Opposing him, Ethan swung his blade in a sweeping arc, unleashing a wave of crimson sword energy that roared through the air. The two forces met in midair, creating a dazzling storm of gold and blood. Under Kenpachi's overwhelming aura, Ethan's bloody crescent faltered, its edge quivering as though bound by invisible chains. The blade snarled in protest, straining to cut free, but Kenpachi gave it no quarter. His fingers clenched tighter, and with a sudden, bone-shattering crack, he funneled all his strength into a single devastating blow. The crimson slash shattered into a spray of jagged fragments, each shard of sword energy rocketing back toward him. Yet before one could land, Kenpachi's golden pressure flared once more, dissolving every last spark of Ethan's attack into nothingness. They were halted as if by an immovable wall. Every strike shattered and vanished beneath Kenpachi Zaraki's overwhelming golden spiritual pressure. He stood unmoved in the wind and rain, a towering mountain of raw power. When the smoke and dust cleared, his cold, towering figure came into full view. A flicker of disdain passed through his eyes, as though Unohana Retsu's attack had barely entertained him. "Is that all you've got?" His voice rolled across the battlefield, equal parts challenge and derision. Unohana Retsu remained calm, her expression serene. She let her hand slide down the length of her blade, savoring its chill, its promise of steel. With a quiet breath, she unleashed her next move. The blade arced through the air in a single, fluid motion, like a silver dragon weaving across the sky, its brilliance slicing at the very fabric of space. Then, gathering every ounce of her strength, she drove the tip downward in a devastating strike, intent on testing the limits of Kenpachi Zaraki's might. Unohana Retsu's assault was nothing like the one before. There were no warning signs or momentary pauses. Her strike came as swiftly and fiercely as a jagged bolt of lightning ripping through the night sky. The very earth seemed to shudder in response, trembling under the weight of her power. Wherever her blade pointed, the air itself cleaved as if it were paper. When the tip of her sword descended, blood spattered in an instant, and Kenpachi Zaraki's formidable Reiatsu shattered first. Though invisible, her cutting force carried devastating substance, so forceful that it rent both his divine vestments and spiritual pressure as easily as though they were scraps of parchment. Kenpachi's eyes widened in stunned surprise. He had not anticipated the razor-sharp precision of Unohana's blow. In the blink of an eye, she was already before him again, the curved edge of her Kaizen flashing downward with indomitable momentum. Channeling every ounce of her strength into that single, relentless slice, she tore through the air with a shrill, slicing roar. Even Kenpachi Zaraki's Enchante, derobes, renowned for their near invulnerability, gave way to the blade as if they were nothing more than parchment. The sword drove on, tearing into his flesh, and blood erupted in a geyser. For a single, suspended moment, time seemed to stop. The coppery scent of blood hung thick in the air, and arcs of crimson liquid shone like macabre fireworks. The blade ripped open Kenpachi's chest, and hot blood showered down across his face and armor. Yet Kenpachi didn't flinch. He could feel the blade's icy edge carving through him, and still a feral grin spread across his face. "That's more like it," he roared. Rather than falling back, he surged forward, offense in place of defense. In his hand, his great sword, Prajna Dem, unleashed a sweeping wave of blade light that seemed poised to sunder the world itself. Unohana Retsu's eyes widened at the display. She twisted, planting her feet to meet the blow head-on. But even so, when Kenpachi's colossal slash struck, the shockwave rattled her to her core. Her body quivered under the impact, but with the sheer weight of her spiritual pressure, she held her ground. A flash of sword energy bursts out behind Unohana Retsu, fracturing against her spiritual pressure and spreading apart in a perfect V. She stands her ground like an unyielding pillar. Clang! The silver-white beam slices through the air again, its sharp ring echoing across the battlefield. Unohana brings her Zanpakuto down in a powerful arc, the virtually indestructible blade slashing into Kenpachi Zaraki's flesh. Yet the rough beast doesn't even flinch. He bellows with savage delight and swings his own greatsword, cleaving the earth around Unohana into jagged craters. Despite her flawless defense, the shockwaves of his strike still tear into her body. Deep, bloodied gouges mar her robes, turning them into hanging rags, and crimson stains spiderweb across her skin. Even so, Unohana doesn't show a hint of pain. Calm and composed, she readies herself for Kenpachi's next onslaught. From the sidelines, Ethan, his interest piqued at last, watches the two combat maniacs with new enthusiasm. Unohana's once elegant attire now hangs in tatters, and the sight of her battered form only sharpens the edge of the spectacle. What began as a brutal clash of titans has become something far more intriguing. The rolling mountains and winding rivers stretched out before them in majestic silence, scenery that might stop anyone in their tracks. Zaraki Kenpachi, however, saw nothing but two massive, useless lumps of flesh and felt a twinge of disgust. His attention was fixed elsewhere, on the gleam of Unohana Retsu's sword, and though he stood there completely naked, Unohana showed no hint of embarrassment. Ethan watched them both with calm detachment. Each fighter's will was so pure that conquering Unohana Retsu would be nearly impossible. Only Kenpachi Zaraki had ever managed it, and he'd done so without the slightest personal interest in her. Ethan himself had long since risen above such fleeting curiosities. He admired only those who stirred something genuine within him. Now, he observed Unohana with nothing more than sincere appreciation for her strength. On the boundless white plain, Unohana and Kenpachi tore across the ground like twin comets, raising clouds of dust in their wake. Then, without warning, Unohana came to an abrupt halt. A brilliant flash of steel split the air as she drew her sword, the sound of rushing wind tearing itself apart under the blade's force. Raw murderous intent and bone-chilling cold radiated from her strike. Her sword light shot forward like a meteor, aimed straight at Kenpachi Zaraki. Unfazed, he planted his feet and met the attack head-on, refusing to yield an inch. But just as Unohana's blade was about to make contact, something inexplicable occurred. Kenpachi Zaraki's blade erupted in a flash of light, the beam slicing cleanly through the air as if it met no resistance. It drew a narrow, glowing arc on the ground and vanished somewhere beyond the horizon. Unohana Retsu froze for a heartbeat, eyes widening in surprise, then let out a low, contemptuous snort. Before she could fully regain her focus, Kenpachi had already launched his counterattack. The prajna demon in his hand swelled into a colossal, nightmarish form. With a single sweeping slash, he unleashed sword pressure so fierce it seemed capable of tearing the very world apart. Unperturbed, Unohana planted her feet firmly on the ground. Her features were serene, every flicker of emotion channeled into unbreakable resolve. With practiced precision, she raised her slender blade, Jiejan, and met the oncoming blow. The two weapons collided in midair with an earth-shaking boom, like the roar of some ancient beast, rending the silence of the night. The shockwave reverberated through the sky and into the hearts of all who watched, leaving them trembling in its wake. Amid a deafening roar, the earth around them vanished in a flash of terrible energy. Solid ground turned to scorched rubble, opening into a yawning, bottomless chasm. The rim, once smooth, white stone, had crumbled away, leaving only a ruined wasteland like some forgotten temple. At the pit's base stood Unohana Retsu and Zaraki Kenpachi. Unohana's long sword pulsed with lethal intent, its blade seeming to hunger for destruction. Every swing sent forked arcs of light slicing through the air, driving Kenpachi steadily backward. Though his fighting spirit was ferocious, he could not withstand her onslaught. Deep, bone-bearing wounds scored his flesh, each one potentially fatal, yet he felt no pain. Clutching the prajna mengui, he struck back again and again with unbridled fury, eyes ablaze with madness and unwillingness to yield. Suddenly, Kenpachi Zaraki let out a ferocious roar. His muscles bulged as if they might burst through his skin, and the prajna mengui in his hand pulsed with raw violence. A torrent of sword pressure, so intense it felt almost tangible, erupted from the blade, slicing through the howling wind and hurtling straight at Unohana Retsu. Like a lightning bolt, cleaving the night sky, it bore down on her with world-shattering force. But Unohana did not flinch. Her gaze was calm and resolute as she tightened her grip on the Jian. In a sudden, graceful motion, she met Kenpachi's onslaught head-on. Boom! The two sword pressures collided in midair, detonating in a blinding explosion of light. It was as if the sun itself had ignited between them, searing eyes that dared to stare. The clashing blades recoiled, and the very ground beneath their feet erupted in a ring of deep craters. Obsidian cracks fanned outward, as though the earth itself were splitting apart under the sheer force of their clash. The clash of blades rang out amid explosive eruptions of spear, ritual energy, and the two warriors battled with savage intensity, both in midair and on the ground. One moment they spiraled skyward, the next they dove toward the earth. Each collision sent tremors through the air, shaking the very ground beneath them. Their speed was a blur, lightning in motion, too swift for the eye to track. Unohana Retsu's sword strikes carried the force of a tempest, every cut imbued with lethal intent. Her blade seemed capable of rending the air itself, leaving no defense against her onslaught. Zaraki Kenpachi, brutal and unyielding as ever, bore fresh scars with each pass, yet he felt no pain. Gripping the great sword Prajna Demon, he refused to relent. Then, amid their furious exchange, Kenpachi shifted tactics. He abandoned sheer force in favor of something more refined, an elegant, precise style of swordsmanship. Unohana's fierce attack faltered for the first time as she watched him. A note of admiration touched her features. Finally, the beast she had been training all this time had learned to truly wield a blade. It was time to teach him how to condense and compress his spiritual pressure. Ethan and Unohana clashed again. Steel against steel rang out like thunder, each blow unleashing concussive shockwaves that rattled the ground. In the heat of their duel, Ethan suddenly dropped his guard and exposed a weakness. Unohana seized the moment. In a blink, she was at his side, Kaizen raised. Her blade sliced through the air, carving twisted black trails that writhed like living shadows. From those trails sprang countless spectral afterimages, phantom blades converging from every direction, so real and so numerous that distinguishing the true strike became impossible. In an instant, blood bloomed along Ethan's neck, and he let out a pained groan. "If you don't master this technique," Unohana said, her voice cold and steady, "you'll die here." Ethan swallowed the pain, tightened his grip on his sword, and lunged forward once more. The battle had raged on for what felt like an eternity, yet its conclusion was surprisingly straightforward. At long last, Kenpachi Zaraki mastered the art of restraining his Reiatsu, channeling every ounce of his spiritual pressure purely into offense and defense. so perfectly controlled that not a single pulse escaped. The difference in his combat prowess was night and day. Unohana Retsu did fall under his onslaught, but she did not die, an outcome that diverged entirely from the original tale. With Ethan at her side, her demise had become all but impossible. Having endured a trial that pitted the first Kenpachi against the strongest he could face, Unohana Retsu finally exhaled, her tumultuous spirit at last finding calm. Chapter 761. Aizen appears in the world. Time moves on, relentless and unyielding. For weeks on end, Unohana Retsu has quietly stoked her murderous intent and battle lust, letting them churn beneath her calm exterior like molten lava. Now at last, those long-restrained emotions have erupted into pure fighting power, an outburst as fierce and sudden as a volcanic explosion. A strange peace gleams in Unohana's eyes. This is no ordinary tranquility, but the profound stillness that comes only after surviving countless skirmishes and near-death trials. It is as though she has poured every ounce of feeling and strength into her recent battle, leaving her spirit both exhausted and heightened. In the world of warriors, they call this state burnout. Yet burnout has its price. Every time Unohana unleashes her secret technique, Jiazan, a fragment of her emotional core, is drained away. Recovering those lost emotions demands time, sometimes weeks of rest and meditation. But Retsu Unohana is, after all, a seasoned killer and a relentless slasher. Few doubt that, given a moment's respite, she will rebuild her reserves of fury and serenity alike, ready to strike again. Ethan's new evolution had pushed his power to unprecedented heights, yet it left him craving a true test of strength. Rumors of Esdeath's overwhelming might reached his ears, and he wasted no time in seeking her out. As he stepped onto the battlefield, sword in hand and eyes alight with anticipation, he felt certain this encounter would satisfy his hunger for combat. Across the clearing, Esdeath awaited him, ice forming in delicate filigree around her blade. The air crackled with cold as she met his gaze, calm, confident, utterly unshaken. Without a word, Ethan lunged. But in a single fluid motion, Esdeath blocked his strike with one hand and countered, forcing him back almost before he'd begun. Shocked, Ethan pressed on relentlessly, each swing of his sword more ferocious than the last. Yet Esdeath parried each blow as if playing with him. Within moments, her cold dominion overwhelmed him. A swift flick of her wrist sent him crashing to the earth. He struggled to rise, snowflakes drifting over his armor. From the sidelines, Ikkaku Madarame and the others watched in stunned silence. Their captain, legendary, indomitable Ethan, lay breathing hard in the snow, bested so completely that it looked almost effortless on Esdeath's part. Awe and fear rippled through the onlookers. The chasm between these two warriors was vast, as if they were on different planes of power altogether. But Ethan's spirit remained unbroken. He pushed himself to one knee, then to his feet, laughter bubbling up despite the cold bite of defeat. "You're incredible," he called out, wiping frost from his cheek. This is exactly the fight I've been craving." He sheathed his sword and bowed slightly, respect shining in his eyes. Though he'd tasted defeat, he was exhilarated. His worry that he might outgrow all challengers melted away. Esdeath remained an unfathomable abyss of strength, one he could neither measure nor rival. Yet, and that promise of a future rematch pulsed through him like fire beneath ice. Ethan stood at the edge of the training field, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Even if he managed to defeat Esdeath, there remained one final obstacle before him, the omniscient God King. That was the true test he craved. He let out a determined breath. "I have to get stronger, fast." Nearby, Ikkaku Madarame sheathed his Zanpakuto and drew his soul blade, the air crackling around its blade. "If we don't push ourselves now, we'll never catch up to the captain," he said, nodding toward Kenpachi Zaraki. Ikkaku stepped forward and dared Kenpachi to spar with him. To the other's surprise, the fearsome captain grinned and accepted without hesitation. Though Ikkaku and the rest were drastically outclassed, Kenpachi patiently invited them to give it their all. Blow after blow, they struck at him, honing their skills against his overwhelming might. On the other side of the field, the Arrancar A encampment lay quiet in comparison. Ulquiorra Sefer and the other elite held back, watching as their comrades tested themselves. Theoretically, Coyote Stark was the strongest among the Arrancar, but he showed no interest in ascending further. He lounged on a crate, arms behind his head, content to pass the days in idle comfort. Beilergen, however, had a different reaction. After witnessing Kenpachi's duel with Esdeath, he fell into a deep, brooding silence. He sensed the vast gulf between their strengths and resolved to close it. Steeling himself, he resumed his training with renewed vigor, focusing every fiber of his being on mastering new techniques. One by one, the other Arrancar watched Beilergen's determination and felt inspiration stir within them. Murmurs of dedication passed through the ranks. More rigorous drills, more relentless practice, more unyielding resolve. Under the watchful sky, two armies, one of Soul Reapers, one of Arrancar, began their journeys of growth. And at the center of it all stood Ethan, heart ablaze with ambition. No matter how daunting the road ahead, he would see it through. The challenge of the God King awaited, and he vowed he would be ready. Ethan stepped into this strange new world like a solitary explorer emerging from darkness. He had fled the realm of his former glory, the place that once celebrated him but also bound him in invisible chains, and now, free of its constraints, he was determined to begin anew. Almost immediately, Ethan set his sights on a mysterious faction known as the Fullbringers. Though few in number and rarely discussed, Fullbringers possessed unique abilities, powers born not of training or external influence, but of something deeper in their very souls. To Ethan, they were an untapped well of secrets, waiting to be understood and perhaps harnessed. But there was more to the Fullbringers than their latent talents. Ethan's research revealed a troubling pattern. These gifted individuals were prime targets for the Hollows, malevolent entities that roamed the fringes of existence. Contrary to earlier theories, that Fullbringers had acquired their powers by suffering hollow attacks, Ethan discovered that it was the Fullbringers' inherent soul traits that drew the Hollows. These creatures sensed that by devouring a Fullbringer, they could absorb not only strength, but some yet undetermined essence. With each new piece of information, Ethan's fascination and resolve grew. He would not rush headlong into danger. First, he would learn everything he could about the bond between Fullbringer and Hollow. Only then would he decide how to proceed, secure in the knowledge that understanding was the key to true power and survival. After uncovering this secret, Ethan became deeply fascinated by the Fullbringers. Determined to learn more, he approached these gifted humans one by one, probing their thoughts and experiences to discover the true source of their power. With his natural charisma and silver tongue, he soon won their trust and even their admiration. Under Ethan's guidance, many Fullbringers came to embrace his vision. They began to echo his beliefs and willingly pledged their abilities to his cause, following him wherever he led. Yet Ethan was not content simply to command their loyalty. The more he worked alongside them, the more he sensed there was something hidden beneath the surface of their powers, something no one had yet uncovered. Through careful study and discreet experiments, Ethan finally unraveled the Fullbringers' greatest secret. Their extraordinary abilities do not arise by chance, but from a rare substance woven into their very souls. It is this unique element that grants them the power to shape the world around them. Remove it, and they lose their Fullbring entirely, reverting to ordinary humans. Realizing the full implications of this discovery, Ethan resolved to delve even deeper into the mysteries of the Fullbringers' souls. He began to design new tests and gather samples of this soul substance, intent on mastering its potential and perhaps unlocking an even greater power for himself. Drawing on Urahara Kisuke's old research, uncovered in the Great Spirit Book Corridor, Aizen devised a way to breach a soul and extract its foreign elements. He successfully drew the unique substance from a Fullbringer's soul and immediately fed it into the Hogyoku. As the Hogyoku absorbed these essences, it grew far more active and powerful. The price of that power was devastating for the Fullbringers. Stripped of their foreign substance, they lost all trace of their Fullbring abilities and reverted to ordinary humans. Aizen felt no guilt or pity. To him, the Fullbringers were nothing more than tools, useful only until their power had been harvested. They should count it an honor to serve the Hogyoku, he told his lieutenants coldly, and at least they will no longer be prey to hollows. Meanwhile, with the Hogyoku now embedded in his own soul, Aizen began regenerating at an extraordinary rate. Under the influence of the Hengyo, the The process of soul fusion was already underway and close to completion. Could you please provide the full text of the chapter you'd like me to rewrite? Once I have the complete passage, I'll revise it into clear, idiomatic English and ensure the main character, now named Ethan, is consistently presented as male.